In the winter of 1943, a German naval officer standing on the concrete dock of Trondheim harbour would have looked out across waters that seemed, to him, impossibly protective. The fjord stretched before him in darkness, not the ordinary darkness of a Norwegian night, but the kind of darkness that swallowed sound itself. Somewhere in that blackness, ice was forming at the margins, and the water, thousands of meters deep in places, held secrets that even the most meticulous German surveyor could not fully map. And yet this officer, whose name we may never know with certainty, believed that he was standing at the edge of something permanent, something that would endure. The Trondheim fjord at night possesses a particular quality that has changed very little since that winter, since that war, since those convictions. The air is thin and cold. It tastes faintly of salt and distant stone. If you were to imagine yourself there, in the darkness, with nothing but the sound of water lapping against wood and concrete, you would hear also the foghorns, those long, mournful calls that ships make when visibility fails them. They echo from the mouth of the fjord toward the interior, traveling miles through the night, absorbed by granite cliffs that have stood for millions of years. Those foghorns are still there. They sound the same way they did then. But this is where the mystery begins, and it is a mystery that has haunted historians and engineers for nearly 80 years. How did the Germans, in the depths of a losing war, manage to build something so ambitious, so immense, in one of the most remote and difficult corners of occupied Europe? How did they pour concrete so thick, reinforce steel so deep underground, command such labor and resources, when they were also fighting on two fronts, running low on fuel, and knowing, perhaps even privately admitting, that their empire was already beginning to collapse? What was it about this fjord, this particular geography, that made it worth such extraordinary effort? And perhaps most haunting of all, what happened to the thing they built when the war ended? And who remembers the hands that constructed it? These are questions that pull us back again and again to a place that most people have never heard of, and yet a place that altered the course of the Second World War in ways that were not fully understood until decades later. If you find yourself drawn to the intricate, lesser-known stories of World War II, to the engineering ambitions, the hidden bases, the desperate strategies of nations in their final hours, then subscribe to this channel for more slow, deeply researched documentaries like this exploration of the Arctic U-boat fortress that Hitler believed could change everything. The story we are about to enter together is not one of grand battles or famous generals. It is, instead, a story written in concrete and ice water, in the exhaustion of workers whose names were never recorded, in the paranoia of an increasingly unstable regime, and in the quiet determination of those who opposed them. It is a story that unfolds almost soundlessly, like the slow freezing of a fjord, and yet it contains within it some of the most profound questions about power, industry, and the price of ambition. So imagine, if you will, that you are aboard a small fishing vessel, the kind that Norwegians have piloted through these waters for centuries. It is night. The engine beneath you is off, and you are drifting. The stars, where you can see them, are extraordinarily bright, because there is no light pollution here, nothing but the vast darkness of the north. You can hear the water moving against the hull. You can feel, more than see, the massive presence of the land on either side of you. The fjord, from this perspective, feels almost alive. It has depth. It has memory. It has, in some way that transcends ordinary geography, the weight of history pressed into its stone. This is the Trondheim fjord, and this is where our journey begins. When we speak of Arctic waters in the context of the Second World War, we are typically imagining something remote, something peripheral, something that belonged to the margins of history. But Trondheim was never marginal, not to the people who understood its strategic value. It was, in fact, one of the most carefully calculated prizes of Hitler's Norwegian campaign. The fjord itself, deep, ice-free even in the coldest months, protected by narrow channels that could be defended by a handful of ships, represented something that the German Kriegsmarine had been dreaming of since before the war began. It represented a place where submarines could hide, where they could be repaired, where they could be sheltered beneath layers of reinforced concrete and rock, so thick that no bomb, no matter how carefully aimed, could easily reach them. But this advantage, this geography that seemed almost too perfect, came with a cost that would haunt the war's aftermath. Because building a fortress, even an Arctic fortress, requires human hands. It requires organization, planning, materials hauled across hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain. It requires decisions, some of them made by men in Berlin who had never seen the fjord, who had only studied its maps and imagined its possibilities. And those decisions would ripple outward, touching the lives of thousands of people, soldiers, engineers, prisoners, forced laborers, civilians trying to simply live their lives in a nation that had been invaded and occupied. The foghorn sounds again, somewhere in the darkness beyond the mouth of the fjord. It is a sound that was heard then, and is heard now, and will be heard long after we are all gone. That constancy, that continuation, is what makes the story we are about to explore so peculiar and so affecting. The fjord remembers, the stone remembers, the water remembers, and if we listen closely enough, if we allow ourselves to drift through this darkness with patience and attention, we might begin to understand what they remember and why it still matters. The cold deepens, the night stretches, and somewhere beneath the surface of those dark waters, in caverns that were carved by human determination and powered by human suffering, the echoes of another era still linger, waiting to be heard. This journey we're beginning together, into the frozen waters and concrete fortresses of Hitler's Arctic vision, is one thread in a vast and intricate tapestry of Second World War history. A history that deserves, perhaps, to be encountered not in the bright glare of urgency, but in the measured, contemplative space that only deep research and unhurried storytelling can create. If you find yourself drawn to these kinds of narratives, where the granular details of engineering and human experience are woven together with geographical precision and the weight of historical consequence, then I'd invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here, we move slowly through the corridors of the past, examining not only what happened, but how people lived within these moments, what they felt, what they feared, what small acts of resistance or complicity shaped their days. Each documentary in this series is built on primary sources, archival material, and the testimonies of those who were there, all of it presented in a way that honors both the severity of this history and your own need for thoughtful, immersive listening. By subscribing, you ensure that these deeper explorations into places like Trondheim, into the stories of U-boat crews and forced laborers, into the intelligence networks and the quiet defiance of occupied peoples, remain part of your world as you drift towards sleep, or as you move through your evenings, seeking something more substantial than the usual treatments of these events. There is something restorative, even in darkness, about understanding where we have been. And so, as the fog thickens over the Norwegian coast and the waters of the Trondheim fjord grow even more still, let us move deeper into the geography that made this place so fateful, the particular character of Norway's coastline, the ice-free harbours that seemed to whisper to the architects of Nazi Germany, the natural features that transformed a regional Norwegian city into one of the most heavily fortified naval bases in all of occupied Europe. The story of Trondheim's choice as Hitler's Arctic lair does not begin with ideology alone, but with something far more concrete: the reading of maps, the understanding of currents and weather patterns, the calculation of distance and defensibility. It begins, in truth, with the simple, relentless geography of the North. The Trondheim fjord cuts inland like a great dark hand reaching into Norway's heart, and it was this geography, more than any political calculation, that would seal the fate of a small medieval city and transform it into something far stranger and more terrible. Picture it first in your mind, not as it is today, but as it revealed itself to naval strategists in the years before the war. The fjord runs nearly 100 kilometers inland from the open sea, wide enough in places for multiple battleships to anchor side by side, yet narrow enough in others that a single coastal gun could command the entire passage. The water here rarely freezes completely, even in the depths of Arctic winter. Warm currents sweep down from the Atlantic, touched by the tail end of the Gulf Stream, and they keep Trondheim Fjord open when nearly every other Norwegian harbour locks itself beneath meters of ice. This single fact, this remarkable gift of oceanography, would make Trondheim irresistible. For centuries, the city had been Norway's gateway to the north, a merchant port and the seat of medieval kings. Its position was never accidental. The cathedral rose above the waterfront, built by men who understood that control of this fjord meant control of trade routes that spiraled up into the Arctic and across toward Russia. By the 1930s, Trondheim had grown quieter, a city of perhaps 50,000 souls, content in its provincial rhythm. But to the south, in Berlin, men with very different ambitions were studying the same maps. They saw what Trondheim possessed, what no other Norwegian port could quite offer in the same measure, a deep water anchorage that would not betray them to ice, surrounded by mountains that could be fortified, hidden from the open sea, yet ready to project power across the Atlantic. The Norwegian coastline itself was a strategic paradox. Stretching more than 25,000 kilometers when you account for all its fjords and islands, it was impossible to defend entirely. Yet every major inlet represented a potential stronghold. The Kriegsmarine, Hitler's navy, had always been the weaker service in his armada, overshadowed by the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht. Yet even a weaker navy needed bases, needed places to repair ships, to fuel the submarines that were meant to strangle British shipping, to shelter the surface raiders that haunted convoy routes. The British had Scapa Flow in the north. The Germans needed their own fortress ports, hidden and reinforced, where their vessels could operate with some measure of safety. Trondheim offered something more seductive still. The fjord's geography meant that a submarine or a destroyer could slip out into the open sea and within hours be operating against the Arctic convoys, the supply lines that the British and Americans were only just beginning to push toward the Soviet Union. From Trondheim, a U-boat captain could reach the critical convoy routes with fuel to spare. From Trondheim, a raider could strike at merchant ships and vanish back into the labyrinth of fjords before Allied ships could intercept it. The distance to Britain's vital shipping lanes was shorter from Trondheim than from any other Norwegian port. The protection offered by the mountains and the deep water was unmatched. Even as you imagine it now, in the darkness, you might picture a U-boat commander studying a chart, recognizing in Trondheim Fjord the answer to a desperate operational problem. But there was something else too, something less tangible but equally powerful in the minds of the strategists. Norway was geographically vast yet sparsely populated. The fjords created natural borders and barriers. The mountains offered concealment. And there was a peculiar quality to the northern light. The midnight sun in summer, the endless twilight of autumn and spring, the deep blue-black darkness of winter that seemed to erase the boundary between sea and sky. It was a landscape that felt remote, separate, almost mythological. To a regime that thought in terms of Lebensraum and Nordic destiny, Norway represented something more than just real estate. It was a frontier, a place where the old romantic notion of conquest and settlement could be revived in a modern form. The ice-free nature of Trondheim fjord became, in the minds of German strategists, almost an argument for inevitability. Geography had placed it there. Oceanography had made it available. The shortage of suitable bases along the entire German-controlled coastline made it necessary. From the moment Hitler began thinking seriously about war in the Atlantic, Trondheim appeared in the calculations. If you wanted to choke British shipping, you needed submarines. If you wanted submarines to operate effectively, you needed bases. And if you needed bases in the north, Trondheim was calling to you across the maps, its dark waters promising shelter, its location promising reach. The city's own population, in the years leading up to the war, had little sense of these grand strategic considerations. They went about their lives, their concerns local and immediate. The weather was changing. The economy was difficult. There were rumors and uncertainties, as there were everywhere in Europe in those years. Yet the city itself, its fjord, its mountains, its ice-free waters, was already spoken for. Long before the first German soldier set foot in Norway, before the first blueprint was drawn for a submarine bunker, Trondheim was being claimed by history. Its geography had made it strategic, its remoteness had made it desirable, and soon, very soon, it would make it unforgettable. And so we arrive at the moment when this remote Norwegian fjord would be drawn into the machinery of European war, not through choice, but through the cold calculations of a distant dictator who saw in these icy waters something both irresistible and essential to his vision of Nordic conquest. In the early spring of 1940, as the thaw was only beginning to touch the Norwegian coast, Adolf Hitler's attention turned northward with an intensity that few in Berlin had anticipated. The decision came not from any grand strategic masterpiece, but from something more immediate and fear-driven, the worry that British naval forces might seize Norway first, establishing themselves in the north as a launching point for pressure against Germany's exposed flank. Britain, Hitler believed, was gathering its strength in these waters, and time was running short. So in April of that year, the Kriegsmarine and Wehrmacht began one of the most audacious amphibious operations that Europe had yet witnessed. Operation Weserübung, the codename for the conquest of Denmark and Norway, and with it, the seizure of Trondheim. The invasion itself unfolded with a kind of terrible choreography. German naval vessels, cruisers, destroyers, and transport ships moving in successive waves pressed northward from the Baltic and North Sea, their hulls carrying thousands of soldiers toward the Norwegian coast. What made this operation both remarkable and precarious was that the Germans were moving without air cover for much of the journey, gambling everything on speed and surprise. And for Trondheim specifically, the target was the capital's maritime lifeline, the port and the fjord that connected the city to the world. The fall of Trondheim itself happened with startling swiftness. By April 9, 1940, the very day the invasion commenced, German forces had already begun their assault on the city. Naval elements pushed up the Trondheim fjord, that same deep channel of dark water we imagined ourselves crossing in the night, and by the evening, the city's defenders found themselves outmatched, overwhelmed, and facing the grim reality that no meaningful relief would be coming from Oslo or from the south. The Norwegian forces, inadequately armed and scattered, could offer only symbolic resistance before the military situation became untenable. Within days, not weeks, Trondheim had fallen into German hands. What strikes one about this conquest, even now, across the gulf of more than 80 years, is how complete it was. Hitler had wanted Trondheim not merely as a conquered city, but as the anchor point for his Arctic naval strategy, a fortress port that would project German power across the North Atlantic and into the Arctic Ocean itself. And he had achieved it with remarkable economy of force. The fjord, with its ice-free waters and its strategic position on the Norwegian coast, had passed from Norwegian sovereignty to German occupation almost before the shock of invasion had fully registered. The people of Trondheim woke in early April to the sound of naval gunfire and aircraft engines. Civilians who had lived in relative peace, though tensions had been rising for months, found themselves suddenly in an occupied city. German soldiers began moving through the streets with the methodical efficiency that would become the hallmark of the occupation. Shops and buildings were commandeered, flags replaced, and the rhythms of civilian life began their strange, terrible adjustment to wartime rule. The fjord, once a source of livelihood and identity for generations of Trondheim's fishing families and merchants, was now becoming something else entirely. The strategic canvas upon which the German Navy would paint its most ambitious designs. It is worth pausing here to reflect on what the speed of this conquest meant. Trondheim, this cathedral city with its long medieval roots and its proud maritime traditions, became a German military possession almost before the population could fully comprehend what had occurred. There was no long siege, no prolonged resistance, no heroic last stand, only the swift, almost inevitable meeting of military force with a nation caught unprepared for the scale of what was coming. In the days and weeks that followed, German engineers and military planners began their first surveys of the port facilities, the harbour depth, the accessibility of the fjord, and most crucially, the possibilities that this location offered for their submarine warfare campaign. What they found was remarkably promising. The fjord offered natural protection. The waters were deep. The distance from British airfields was substantial enough to provide some safety margin, and most importantly, the position was far enough north that it could serve as an advanced base for operations against Arctic convoy routes and against Soviet waters, routes that would soon become critical to the Nazi war effort. The conquest of Trondheim, in retrospect, was the gateway. It was the moment when the Wehrmacht's ambitions in the north crystallized into concrete possibility. The city itself, its fjord, its port facilities, all of this would now serve as the foundation for something far more ambitious, the creation of a submarine fortress that would, in Hitler's imagination, dominate the far northern sea lanes and threaten both British supply lines and eventually the Soviet Union's vulnerable Arctic coast. Consider, as you follow this thread of history deeper, how many places in the world experience such a sudden, dramatic rupture between one world and another. Trondheim's citizens on April 8, 1940, had no way of knowing that they were about to become inhabitants of an occupied land, residents of a military fortress that would shape not only the next 5 years of their lives, but would leave permanent marks, physical and psychological, that would echo far beyond the end of the war itself. The fjord's dark waters, which had seemed eternal and unchanging, were about to receive the machinery of total war, and nothing would ever be quite the same. In the spring of 1940, as German forces swept through Norway with a swiftness that surprised even the Wehrmacht's own planners, Adolf Hitler stood in his war rooms and began to articulate a vision that would reshape military strategy in the far north for the remainder of the war. Norway, he believed, was not merely another conquered territory. It was something far more mythologically potent in his imagination. It was the zone of destiny. That phrase, spoken and written in German military circles with growing frequency, carried within it a peculiar blend of geopolitical calculation and the darker romantic ideologies that animated Nazi thinking. The phrase suggested that Norway held a kind of cosmic significance, a place where the fate of the German Reich would be either secured or imperiled. And in that belief, one can begin to trace the roots of the most ambitious and desperate Arctic fortification project ever undertaken. What drove this obsession? On the surface, the answer seemed straightforward. The coastline, the fjords, the strategic positioning between the Atlantic and the Arctic, the choke point through which convoys of vital supplies moved toward the Soviet Union. But there was something deeper, something more personal in Hitler's fixation. He had become convinced, with the fervor of a man who saw patterns and portents in every map and every intelligence report, that the Allies would attempt to invade Scandinavia, not as a primary objective perhaps, but as an operation to secure a northern flank, to establish air bases, to threaten German-held Norway and cut German supply lines running up the coast toward occupied Soviet territories. It was a fear that had some grounding in strategic reality. The British, in particular, had shown interest in operations in northern waters. But as 1941 turned into 1942, this concern began to harden in Hitler's mind into something approaching obsession. Consider the psychological landscape here. Hitler had already turned on the Soviet Union, launched Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, and found himself locked in a grinding continental struggle that demanded everything the German war machine could produce. And yet, even as millions of troops fought in the frozen steppes of Russia, even as the Wehrmacht's resources stretched ever thinner, Hitler was directing naval and military planners to fortify Norway as if an invasion force might materialize over the horizon at any moment. It was a curious paradox. The very man who was bleeding the German state dry with the Russian campaign simultaneously insisted that Norway be defended with an almost paranoid intensity. Why? Because he believed, quite genuinely, that Germany's enemies would seek to turn the Arctic against him. This fear was not entirely baseless. The British, smarting from the loss of Norway in 1940, had indeed mounted small commando raids against the Norwegian coast. The most famous of these, Operation Chariot, had struck the great French battleship Richelieu. Others had probed German coastal defences. These raids, while small in scale, had had an outsized psychological effect. They demonstrated that no conquered territory was safe from British harassment. They showed that the northern waters remained contested, even if German ships sailed them. And to a mind like Hitler's, prone to reading grand historical narratives into military details, these raids confirmed his worst suspicions. The north, he believed, would become a battleground. The Allies would not leave Norway in German hands unmolested. There was also, woven through Hitler's thinking, a peculiar strand of Nordic mysticism and racial ideology. Norway, in the Nazi worldview, was occupied by peoples of racial stock worth preserving and incorporating into the greater Germanic Reich. It was, in a sense, home. Territory, even if conquered, because it belonged to people deemed racially acceptable. This added an emotional, almost defensive dimension to his strategic concerns. He was not merely protecting a military prize, he was defending what he imagined to be a northern bastion of Aryan civilization. The language in Nazi documents becomes markedly different when discussing Norway, compared to, say, France or the Low Countries. There is a possessiveness, an almost familial quality to the rhetoric. Norway was not simply to be held, it was to be integrated, fortified, made part of the core defensive perimeter of what Hitler imagined would be a 1,000-year Reich. As the war deepened, and as Germany's overall position began, almost imperceptibly at first, and then with gathering momentum, to deteriorate, this obsession with Norway only intensified. It is a curious phenomenon in military history, how leaders cling more fiercely to territories as the likelihood of losing them increases. By 1943 and 1944, as German reverses multiplied on every front, Norway began to loom larger in Hitler's calculations. He poured resources into its defense. He diverted troops from other theaters. He insisted on massive fortification projects that consumed concrete, steel, and labor at staggering rates. All of this in the service of defending a territory that, strategically speaking, had become almost secondary to the larger catastrophe unfolding in Eastern Europe and eventually in the West as well. What can we make of this? One interpretation, favored by some historians, suggests that Hitler's obsession with Norway represented a kind of strategic fantasy, a place where, in his imagination, he could still achieve victory or at least preserve something from the wreckage of his ambitions. Norway, distant from the primary theatres of war, offered a kind of escape from reality. He could plan its fortification without immediately confronting the evidence of failures elsewhere. The Arctic could become, in his mind, a realm of possibility even as the rest of Europe slipped from German grasp. There is a poignancy in this, though perhaps an undeserved one. The men who would labor and die in those Arctic bunkers, and the Norwegians displaced or oppressed in the course of building Hitler's fantasy fortress, paid dearly for these psychological projections of a distant tyrant. Another thread to consider: Hitler's fear of invasion may not have been entirely paranoid. If Germany had continued to hold Scandinavia unchallenged, the Allies would certainly have faced a serious strategic problem. A German-held Norway, with U-boat bases and air bases, would threaten any future invasion of continental Europe from the north. The Allies would need to neutralize it or bypass it. And so, in insisting that Norway be defended with maximum vigor, in demanding that the most modern fortification technology be applied there, in sending the best troops and resources northward, Hitler was actually, in a roundabout way, acting with some strategic sense, not because he would ultimately succeed, but because he was correctly identifying a place where, with sufficient investment, he might make the Allies pay a serious price. The practical consequence of all this was the decision to build the most powerful submarine bunker in the entire Atlantic Wall system, not in France or Germany, but here in Trondheim, deep in the Norwegian fjord, farther north than any German had planned just years earlier. This was the logical outcome of Hitler's obsession with the zone of destiny. If Norway was to be held, then the naval fortress that defended it and projected German power from it must be the strongest, the most impregnable, the most secure installation that German engineering could devise. And so the planners and engineers turned their attention to the rock and water of the Trondheim fjord and began to imagine a structure so vast, so deeply buried, so reinforced, that it would be almost immune to any weapon the enemy might bring to bear against it. The obsession that had animated Hitler's strategic thinking would now be made concrete. Literally, hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of it, in the far north. Yet even as Hitler's gaze fixed on Norway as his fortress, he harbored a deeper, quieter obsession, one that lived beneath the waves and demanded bases as formidable as the submarines themselves. The Atlantic U-boat pens. They were to be the armored cathedrals of Nazi naval power, structures so monumental, so thickly reinforced, that Allied bombs seemed almost futile against them. 5 major installations rose across occupied Europe: concrete monoliths in France at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux. Each one was a fortress within a fortress, designed to shelter the U-boats that prowled the Atlantic hunting merchant convoys, stalking warships, strangling Britain's lifeline to the New World. But there was a problem, one that gnawed at the German Admiralty with each passing season. These 5 great pens, essential as they were, lay anchored to the southern and western coasts, and they were increasingly within range of Allied air raids based in Britain and, after 1944, in liberated France itself. And so, in the dreams of German strategic planners, there emerged a necessity that seemed almost obvious in its logic. If U-boats were to operate far into the Arctic, if they were to interdict the northern convoy routes that fed Russia and harried German positions with supplies, then the submarines needed a base that could not simply be damaged or disrupted by conventional bombing. They needed a fortress so far north, so heavily shielded, that perhaps, just perhaps, it might survive the war itself. That base would be Trondheim. Consider the mathematics of it. A U-boat, departing from Brest or Lorient, faced a long, fuel-expensive transit southward before it could even begin its patrol. But a submarine based in the northern Norwegian fjords could strike almost immediately into the Barents Sea, into the frozen waters where the Arctic convoys steamed their perilous route. The geography was nothing short of perfect. Trondheim's fjord stretched inland like a navigable dagger, deep enough for any submarine to slip through at high tide, protected by geography itself from the worst of North Atlantic swells. The water rarely froze entirely. That was the extraordinary gift of the Gulf Stream, which carried warmth from the south even as winter gripped the Arctic, meaning the base could operate year-round when so much of the Northern Ocean was locked in ice. For the Kriegsmarine, it was almost as though nature herself had prepared the place. But there was something more, something that spoke to Hitler's peculiar vision of the future. A northern base, deep in Norwegian territory, would serve a second purpose. It would anchor German power in what was becoming, in the Führer's imagination, a territory of supreme strategic importance. If the Allies were to invade Europe, and by 1943 German planners were increasingly certain they would, then the Arctic flank could not be left undefended. A U-boat base at Trondheim was both a striking weapon and a guard against invasion. It was, in a sense, the ultimate expression of Hitler's obsession with Norway as the zone of destiny, transformed from abstract geopolitical theory into something made of steel and concrete and seawater. The decision was made sometime in 1942, though the precise moment is lost in the fog of wartime archives and competing claims of ambition among rival military factions. The Kriegsmarine wanted it, the Nazi leadership wanted it, and so the orders cascaded down from Berlin, through the occupation administration, into the labyrinth of German military construction programs. A new installation would be built. It would be called, with the bureaucratic understatement that characterized German military nomenclature, the Dora bunker, or, more formally, the U-boat pen facility at Trondheim, designed to shelter and service submarines deep within a man-made cavern excavated from solid rock. It would be, in the estimation of its planners, unsinkable. It would be, or so they believed, the future. The decision to build Dora, though, was not made in isolation. It emerged from a broader network of thinking about Atlantic U-boat operations and the geography of German-occupied Europe. By the middle of 1942, the great French pens were increasingly under pressure from RAF bombers. The tonnage sunk by U-boats in the Atlantic was still measured in the millions, but the mathematics were turning against Germany. More merchant ships were being built in America than were being sunk. The U-boat threat, while still formidable, was beginning to feel less like a war-winning weapon and more like a desperate hope extended indefinitely. In this context, the idea of pushing farther north, of establishing a base that could both extend U-boat operations and anchor them in territory less immediately threatened by air attack, began to seem like a reasonable, even necessary, strategic move. Trondheim was not the only location under consideration. There were proposals for installations in other Norwegian fjords, some even more remote. But Trondheim possessed the crucial combination of elements: the deep water fjord, the ice-free harbour, the proximity to major sea lanes, and perhaps most importantly, an existing German occupation infrastructure. The city was already garrisoned, already connected to German supply lines, already embedded within the web of German military command in Norway. To build Dora at Trondheim was therefore not simply to create an isolated fortress in the Arctic. It was to deepen Germany's presence in what Hitler regarded as the northernmost bulwark of his European empire. Think of it as a layering of strategic ambitions, each one connected to the others, each one reinforcing the others in the minds of Nazi planners. The U-boats needed a base. The base needed to be invulnerable. Invulnerability required distance from Allied air bases, Distance from Allied air bases meant going north, into Norwegian territory. Norwegian territory was a zone of destiny that must be held and fortified. Fortification meant digging deep, pouring concrete, marshalling resources, and above all, controlling the fjord. And in Trondheim, with its dark waters and its strategic perfection, all of these threads came together. The men who conceived Dora imagined, perhaps, that they were building something that might outlast the Reich itself, a monument to German engineering prowess, a structure so formidable that perhaps, just perhaps, history itself might pause before it. They were, in a way, building not for the present, but for a future they hoped would never come. And so, in the winter of 1940, as the German Navy began to reshape the Norwegian coast in their image, the architects and engineers of the Kriegsmarine turned their attention to a project that would consume years, resources, and countless lives. They had secured Trondheim. They had positioned their U-boats in a harbour that seemed almost divinely suited to their purposes. But possession alone was not enough. What they dreamed of, what Hitler himself demanded, was something far more ambitious, a fortress so impregnable, so perfectly engineered, that no Allied bomb, no matter how powerful, could ever breach its walls. The project received a code name drawn from the German letter of the alphabet. They called it Dora. In the secret language of Nazi military planning, a simple letter could encompass vast ambitions, and Dora was to be precisely that, the northernmost, the deepest, and perhaps the most elaborately fortified U-boat bunker in the entire German arsenal. While similar pens were being constructed along the Atlantic coast of France, at Saint-Nazaire and Lorient and La Pallice, Dora would stand alone in the Arctic, a bastion of German naval power so far north that no conventional logic seemed to suggest it could possibly be built at all. The vision, as it took shape in the minds of German naval planners in Berlin and Oslo, was almost mythological in its scope. Here, carved into the living rock of the Norwegian fjord, would rise reinforced concrete structures that would serve as shelters for the U-boats themselves, as maintenance facilities, as command centers, and as living quarters for the crews who would man them. The bunker would house the submarines in individual pens, each one shielded from aerial attack by ceilings of concrete poured to thicknesses that seemed to belong more to medieval fortifications than to 20th century engineering. Multiple meters thick, sometimes estimates suggested as much as 4 or 5 meters, these ceilings were designed with the understanding that the Allies would eventually throw their heaviest bombs at whatever rose above the fjord's surface. Picture, if you will, the engineering proposals as they were sketched and refined. The U-boats would slip through the narrow entrance of the fjord, pass through carefully placed booms and anti-submarine nets, and then glide into the bunker itself, where they would be housed in cavernous chambers, protected from the world outside. The rock itself would be their greatest ally. The Norwegian fjord's natural rock formations, subjected to ancient glaciation, had created stone of remarkable density and hardness. Blast walls would be constructed within these chambers. Ventilation systems would be engineered to sustain the crews and keep the boats in operational readiness. It would be, in essence, an underground shipyard and fortress combined, a place where the enemy's air superiority counted for nothing. The ambition behind Dora was rooted in something deeper than mere military pragmatism. By 1942 and 43, as the war at sea began to turn against Germany, as their surface fleet dwindled and their U-boat losses mounted, the Kriegsmarine found itself grasping for solutions that seemed almost desperate in their grandiosity. The U-boat war, the guerre de course, was failing. American convoy protection was improving. British anti-submarine tactics were becoming more sophisticated and lethal. What if, the thinking went, the submarines themselves could be made invulnerable while in port? What if they could be sustained, repaired, and replenished in a fortress that no bomb could touch. Perhaps then the tide could be turned. Perhaps then the Atlantic could be made German once again. Dora represented this logic taken to its extreme. It was not merely a bunker for submarines. It was a statement of faith in technology, in engineering mastery, in the German capacity to overcome any material obstacle through sheer will and ingenuity. The very act of planning it, of beginning its construction, was meant to demonstrate that Germany possessed the vision, the resources, and the capability to shape the future according to its designs. That it would ultimately fail to deliver on these grand promises is a different story, one we will trace carefully as our journey through these cold fjord waters continues. The formal decision to construct Dora came down through military channels in 1942. By then, Trondheim had been in German hands for 2 years. The initial occupation had been swift and brutal, but it had also revealed the port's vulnerabilities. It was too exposed. It lay too far from the main German naval bases. The submarines that sheltered there were, despite all precautions, still threatened by Allied air raids. A bunker, then, was not merely desirable. In the minds of German planners, it had become essential. The project was placed under the authority of the Kriegsmarine's Construction and Fortification Division. Plans were drawn up by architects and engineers, both German and Norwegian. The scale of the undertaking became clearer with each passing month. The bunker would not be a simple shelter, hastily thrown together. It would be a marvel of modern construction, a structure that would require the excavation of hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of rock, the pouring of tens of thousands of cubic meters of concrete, the installation of sophisticated mechanical and electrical systems, and the organization of a massive labor force that would toil through the long Arctic winters under conditions that the planners in Berlin could scarcely have imagined. Some historians have noted, in their careful examinations of the documentary record, that the scale of Dora's ambitions seemed to grow with each revision of the plans. What began as a straightforward U-boat pen evolved into something far more complex. There would not be one chamber, but multiple chambers. There would not be simple concrete walls, but elaborate fortifications, anti-torpedo baffles, and water exclusion systems. The deeper the designers dug into the technical requirements, the more elaborate the vision became. It was as though, with each obstacle encountered, the Germans responded not by simplifying, but by building ever more massive and intricate solutions. The reality, of course, was that this ambition would collide with material reality in ways that the planners had not fully anticipated. The Arctic climate would prove more unforgiving than expected. The rock formations, while generally solid, contained fissures and weaknesses that demanded constant adaptation. The labor force, drawn from many nations and backgrounds, would labor under conditions so harsh that disease, malnutrition, and cold would claim hundreds of lives before the bunker was ever truly complete. The Allies, for their part, would not remain passive observers. Intelligence about the project would leak out through various channels: resistance networks, escaped prisoners, German deserters, and it would eventually become a target of strategic bombing campaigns that, while not always successful, would nonetheless hamper its construction and force repeated revisions to the timelines and the designs. But in 1942, in the spring when the decision was formally made, none of this was yet known or anticipated. What existed was the vision, pure and unyielding, an Arctic fortress, an unsinkable bastion, a monument to German engineering and will. The Dora project, under that simple, austere letter of a code name, was born, and in the coming months and years, it would draw to itself the labor, the resources, and the sacrifice that such an ambition demanded. The rocks of Trondheim would be split open, the fjord would echo with the sound of construction, and into this growing fortress, the submarines would eventually come, their crews hoping that here, At last, they might find sanctuary from the gathering storm that raged across the Atlantic and the Arctic seas beyond. What exactly does it mean to build a fortress inside a mountain? To carve not merely a shelter, but an entire, functioning military installation into living rock itself? This was the question that consumed the minds of German naval architects and engineers as they stood on the shores of Trondheim fjord in the spring of 1941, surveying the granite cliffs that would become Dora. The site chosen lay on the eastern shore of the fjord, near the small locality of Trondheim, where the mountains rose sharply from the water's edge and the granite beneath the surface ran deep. What made this location perfect was not only its geography, but its geology. The Norwegian bedrock here, formed over millions of years, possessed a structural density and stability that engineers recognized immediately. This was not soft limestone or fractured shale. This was ancient granite, dense and strong, capable of withstanding not only the weight of a mountain above it, but the concussive force of bombs falling from the sky. The engineering plans drawn up by the Kriegsmarine's construction teams were, by any measure, extraordinary. The primary bunker complex, designated Dora 1, was conceived as a massive underground cathedral of reinforced concrete and excavated rock. Imagine, if you will, a structure measuring approximately 150 meters in length, with a width that varied between 30 and 40 meters depending on the chamber. The main tunnel ran horizontally into the mountainside, sloping gently downward toward the interior, allowing U-boats to enter from the fjord itself through carefully engineered canal systems that connected to the open water outside. The ceiling of the main bunker chamber was the critical element of the entire design. Here lay the ingenuity and the ambition of the project. Rather than relying solely on the natural rock overhead, German engineers specified a reinforced concrete roof of breathtaking thickness. This was to be no simple concrete slab. The specifications called for a layered construction, sometimes reaching depths of nearly 6 meters or more in the most critical sections. The concrete itself was specially formulated, incorporating specific aggregate ratios and Portland cement compositions designed to maximize both its tensile and compressive strength. Steel reinforcement ran through this concrete in a dense lattice, creating a structural matrix that was, quite literally, nearly impossible to penetrate from above. The walls themselves, where they departed from the natural rock, were equally formidable. Concrete, poured to thicknesses of several meters, reinforced with steel rebar of varying gauges, created barriers designed to contain explosions, to redirect blast waves, to absorb and dissipate the energy of impact. The floor of the bunker complex was poured concrete as well, sloped and drained to manage water seepage, treated with special compounds to resist both moisture and the corrosive effects of seawater that inevitably penetrated even the most carefully sealed underground structures. But the sheer scale of the undertaking becomes apparent only when one considers not merely the main tunnel, but the entire complex that surrounded it. For Dora was not simply a single chamber carved into rock, it was a network. Subsidiary tunnels branched off from the main passage, leading to ammunition storage rooms, fuel depots, living quarters for officers and men, command centers equipped with the latest communications equipment, medical facilities, and secure storage vaults for navigational charts and operational intelligence. Each of these chambers had to be excavated, reinforced, and equipped to function independently if necessary, yet in perfect coordination with the whole. The ventilation system alone represented a feat of engineering that merits quiet contemplation. How does one draw fresh air into a bunker buried deep in a mountain, while simultaneously ensuring that no poisonous gases accumulate in the various chambers and passageways? The solution involved a complex system of intake shafts, running upward through the mountain, fitted with filters designed to screen out chemical or biological agents, connected to powerful mechanical fans that could be run on electricity or backed up by diesel generators. The exhaust system was equally sophisticated, with outlets positioned to avoid creating visible steam or vapor clouds that might alert aerial observers to the bunker's location and function. And then there was the matter of water. The fjord was only meters away from the bunker entrance. Water would inevitably seep through cracks in the rock, through fissures in the concrete, through every tiny gap where human engineering met the forces of nature. Special drainage channels were cut into the rock during excavation, sloped to direct this water toward collection sumps deep within the bunker complex. Powerful pump systems, again with diesel backup in case of electrical failure, would continuously remove this water, preventing any accumulation that might compromise structural integrity or create hazardous conditions for the crews living and working underground. The scale of the excavation itself staggers the imagination. To carve out the main tunnel alone required the removal of tens of thousands of cubic meters of rock. The engineers calculated that this excavation, using the hand tools, explosives, and primitive machinery available in the early 1940s, would require an enormous labor force working continuously for months. They were correct in this assessment, though perhaps they underestimated just how enormous that force would need to be. The construction also incorporated specific spaces designed for the U-boats themselves. The main tunnel was engineered to accommodate 2, sometimes 3 large Type Virk U-boats simultaneously. These boats, measuring roughly 67 meters in length and requiring a draft of approximately 4.7 meters, needed sufficient depth and width to be maneuvered into position, where they could rest safely while crews conducted maintenance, repairs, and supply operations. Thick concrete caissons, or covers, were designed to be positioned over the boats while they rested in the bunker, providing protection from air attack and allowing internal work to continue even during bombing raids. One cannot overstate the ambition embedded in these plans. German engineers were attempting to create something that had never been built before, at such a scale and with such specifications. The Atlantic U-boat pens in France, at Lorient, at Saint-Nazaire, at La Pallice, had pushed the boundaries of what concrete construction could achieve, but Dora was designed to surpass them. The plans called for a facility that would be, in theory, virtually invulnerable to aerial bombardment. The combination of deep underground location, massive concrete shielding, and careful sighting within the mountainous terrain of Norway was meant to ensure that Allied bombing could never render the facility inoperable. Whether this ambition was grounded in realistic engineering assessment or in the wishful thinking that often accompanied Nazi military planning remains a matter of some scholarly debate, though the physical evidence that survives today suggests that the engineers knew what they were doing. The structure they designed was, demonstrably, far more resilient to bombing than many other military installations of the era. The plans also specified sophisticated heating and cooling systems to maintain comfortable working conditions for the crews, electrical distribution networks to power the countless devices and machinery that U-boats and their supporting infrastructure required, and communications systems that would allow the bunker to remain in constant contact with naval command centers in Kiel and Berlin. Underground bunkers in winter are cold, damp places. Trondheim's winters are particularly harsh, with temperatures regularly falling well below freezing. The engineers understood that men working in such conditions for hours at a time would need not only adequate heating, but also adequate rest and recuperation facilities. And perhaps most tellingly, the plans included specifications for a series of backup systems for virtually every critical function. If the primary diesel generators failed, secondary generators could take over. If the main ventilation fans ceased operating, manual backup systems existed. If communications cables were severed, alternative routing through backup circuits could be activated. This redundancy spoke to a deep understanding of the fragility of mechanical systems and the absolute necessity of maintaining continuous function in a military installation under stress. As one examines these engineering specifications, these carefully drawn diagrams with their precise measurements and dense annotations, one begins to grasp the scale of what was being attempted. This was not a simple bomb shelter or a conventional naval base being expanded underground. This was an entirely new category of military installation, a subterranean fortress designed and engineered to dominate an entire region of the Arctic theater for as long as the war might last. The concrete alone, once it had all been poured and set, would weigh tens of thousands of tons. Yet all of these plans, all of this engineering ambition, required something that no blueprint could create on its own. It required hands, it required bodies, it required men, and increasingly forced laborers and prisoners, willing and unwilling to take up tools and begin the grim work of carving this vision into reality. The scale of Dora demanded more than engineering ambition. It demanded bodies, thousands of them, and in Nazi-occupied Europe, there was a system already in place, already grinding forward with terrible efficiency, designed to supply them. By 1941, when serious construction began in earnest on the Trondheim bunker complex, the German Reich had access to an almost unlimited reservoir of forced labor. There were prisoners of war, thousands of them, captured during the sweep through Norway itself, and later from across the Soviet Union. There were deportees, civilians rounded up from occupied territories, marked for relocation to this frozen northern coast. And there were those we might call political prisoners, men and women deemed enemies of the Reich, for reasons ranging from resistance activity to nothing more substantial than being in the wrong place when the trucks arrived. The work on Dora was not organized with the industrial dehumanization of Auschwitz or Treblinka, but it shared the same fundamental architecture of coercion. The bunker required the excavation of enormous quantities of rock and stone. It required the placement of intricate reinforced concrete, work that demanded precision, attention, and the kind of sustained physical labor that could only be sustained through threat and deprivation. The German engineers knew this, the contractors knew this, and the SS guards who were detailed to oversee the camps surrounding the construction site knew this above all. The living conditions were sparse. Barracks had been hastily constructed near the site, uninsulated structures that offered little protection against the Arctic cold that descended as autumn turned to winter. Men slept on thin straw mattresses, sometimes 2 to a bunk, sometimes 3. The food rations were calculated by the Nazis to be barely sufficient to sustain life if one were sedentary, and wholly insufficient for men laboring 10, sometimes 12 hours a day in the open air, often in wet conditions. Soup made from turnips and potato peelings, hard black bread, occasionally a thin smear of margarine. The caloric intake was perhaps 1,500 calories a day, sometimes less. A man digging rock and concrete, especially in the cold, burns 3,000. The guards, many of them drawn from the SS or from the TOT organization, the vast construction arm of the Nazi state, were brutal in the manner that brutality becomes when it is systematized, made ordinary. A man could be beaten for working too slowly. A man could be beaten for looking at a guard with insufficient deference. A man could be beaten for being sick and unable to work. The beatings were not always lethal in themselves, but they compounded the other privations. An injury in a camp with minimal medical facilities could become gangrenous. A broken rib could become pneumonia. A concussion could mean confusion and disorientation that led to accidents that led to death. The death rate among the labor force is difficult to establish with precision, for records were poorly kept or deliberately obscured. But historians studying the construction of German wartime installations, the bunkers, the fortifications, the vast subterranean factories, have estimated that perhaps 10 to 15% of the forced laborers died during construction periods. Some installations saw higher rates. At Dora, the figure may have been somewhere in that range, though the exact numbers remain uncertain. What is clear is that men died, many of them, and their bodies were disposed of quietly, registered as deaths from natural causes, or sometimes simply not registered at all. Among the labor force were Soviet prisoners of war. The Soviet Union had suffered enormous losses in the first years of the invasion, and hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers had been captured, marched westward into camps that ranged from poor to absolutely catastrophic. Many thousands of these men were then shipped north to Norway to labor on German military installations. They were generally treated worse than other categories of prisoner, in accordance with Nazi racial ideology. Soviet prisoners were regarded as subhuman, expendable. The mortality rate among Soviet POWs was staggering, perhaps 50% or higher in some camps. At Dora, the Soviet prisoners worked alongside others: Norwegian conscripts, French prisoners, Polish deportees, Germans themselves who had been deemed politically unreliable. There were also a significant number of workers who were not quite prisoners in the formal sense, but conscripted Norwegian civilians. The German occupation authority had the power to compel Norwegian men to work on military projects deemed essential to the defense of the territory. Many complied, not out of enthusiasm for the Reich, but out of a kind of grim practicality. A man conscripted to work on the bunker at least received food, meagre though it was, and was less likely to be summarily shot than a man who resisted. The line between coercion and choice, between prisoner and worker, was often blurred in the occupied territories. What was the experience of these men? It is difficult to imagine across the gulf of nearly 80 years. The work was meaningless to them. They were not building this bunker out of belief in the Reich or faith in victory. They were building it because refusing to build it meant death. Some, perhaps, found a kind of stoic meaning in simply enduring, in surviving another day, in maintaining some small corner of their humanity in the face of dehumanization. Others likely fell into numbness, that peculiar state of mind in which one simply continues because continuance is the path of least immediate resistance. There are accounts, fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, from those who survived. One former Polish deportee recalled the sound of the jackhammers, the endless chiming of metal on rock, so constant that one's ears seemed to ring with it even when work stopped. He recalled the way ice formed on men's faces when they emerged from the warmth of deep excavation into the Arctic air. Another, a Soviet officer, recorded in a secret diary, hidden, preserved, later discovered, the precise moment when he understood that the Germans had no intention of allowing most of the workers to leave alive. That understanding came not from any explicit statement, but from small observations: the way the guards began segregating certain prisoners, the way medical care was withheld from men with serious injuries, the way bodies were being counted and recorded differently. The TOT organization, the Nazi construction authority overseeing the work, operated according to a kind of calculated cold logic. Workers were a resource, like steel or concrete. When they wore out, they were replaced. When they became too weak to work, they were removed from the camp. The term removed is the historical language. Where they went, what happened to them was often left unspecified. Some were transferred to other camps. Some were shot. Some simply died of starvation or cold or disease in the camp itself, and their bodies buried in unmarked graves that, in many cases, have never been properly located. How many men labored on Dora in total? Estimates suggest between 5 and 10,000, passing through the camp or camps surrounding the construction site over the course of several years. How many died? The numbers are elusive. The SS was not scrupulous in maintaining death records. But if we accept the broader historical estimates for similar installations, and if we account for the particular harshness of the Arctic conditions and the brutality of the TOT organization's practices, we might reasonably suggest that hundreds died, perhaps more. The exact figure is a kind of unknown, a question that cannot be definitively answered from the surviving records. And yet the work continued. The concrete was poured, the steel was set, the rock was excavated. The bunker rose, day by day, week by week, month by month. Each block of concrete was, in a sense, a small monument to coercion, to the machinery of the Nazi state's ability to mobilize human suffering in service of strategic ambition. The men who built it largely did not survive the war. Many would die in camps, or in the chaos of 1945, or in the slow privation of the years immediately after. Few would be recognized as forced laborers in the immediate post-war period. Many of their names were never recorded. Their stories, for decades, remained untold. While engineers and laborers worked in the deepening cold of the fjord, the city of Trondheim itself was undergoing a strange and unsettling transformation. The ordinary rhythms of civilian life continued on the narrow streets and in the modest wooden homes that clustered near the water, yet nothing was truly ordinary anymore. The people who lived there, going about their daily errands, buying bread from the bakery, collecting rations, tending small gardens in the brief summer months, were now living in the shadow of something vast and increasingly militarized. Picture, if you will, a morning in Trondheim during the middle years of the war, perhaps 1942 or 1943. The light comes early in that latitude, pale and translucent even when the skies are heavy. A woman might wake and listen to the sounds filtering through her window, the calls of workers heading toward the construction sites, the distant rumble of trucks carrying materials down toward the fjord, the low thrum of engines and machinery that had become the background music of occupation. She would rise, dress in the careful way one dressed during rationing, and move through her day with the particular kind of resignation that comes when your world has been militarized around you without your consent. The Germans had occupied Norway, and Trondheim in particular, with what seemed at first like a measure of civility that contrasted sharply with the brutality being inflicted elsewhere on the continent. There were no mass roundups in Trondheim as there were in other occupied territories. Life, on the surface, maintained a kind of order, but that order was the order of occupation, and it pressed down on everything. Soldiers moved through the streets in their field grey uniforms. Supply convoys rolled constantly. The harbour, which had always been the lifeblood of the city, became something else entirely, a strategic asset, a fortress being built piece by piece. For the shopkeepers and teachers, for the dock workers and the fishermen, whose profession had been transformed by wartime restrictions, there was the constant, quiet knowledge that their city had become host to an increasingly important military installation. Some residents welcomed the economic activity, the jobs that came with the construction boom, even as those jobs often meant witnessing terrible conditions imposed on the forced laborers who did much of the hardest work. Others felt a slow, corrosive sense of being complicit, simply by remaining, by continuing to live their lives in a place that was becoming a hub of German military power. The Norwegian winter pressed down with its familiar weight. Darkness descended in November and did not fully lift until February. During those months, the construction of Dora proceeded under electric lights, and the glow of the work sites reflected off the snow and the frozen water. Residents in certain quarters of the city could see that glow from their windows at night, a constant reminder that something enormous was being built beneath their feet, or at least very close to their homes. Some people found it ominous. Others had learned not to think too deeply about it. This was a survival mechanism, a way of getting through each day without the weight of full awareness bearing down too heavily on the mind. Food was scarce, as it was in all of occupied Europe. But Norway's position as a food producer meant that conditions here were somewhat better than in some other places. Fish from the fjord appeared on tables when it could be obtained. There was dark bread, thin soups, occasional cheese. The rationing was systematic and orderly in the German manner, which meant that civilian rations were calculated with mathematical precision and distributed with bureaucratic efficiency. It also meant that they were often inadequate, especially as the war progressed and German resources became increasingly stretched. The sound of construction became the daily rhythm of Trondheim. Hammering, the screeching of metal, the crash of falling materials, the shouts of foremen, these sounds echoed across the water and through the streets. They were the sounds of the bunker being built, of concrete being poured and reinforced, of the enormous machinery being installed. For children growing up during this time, these sounds became simply the normal backdrop of existence, as natural as birdsong or the cry of gulls. But for adults who remembered the city before the occupation, each of those sounds was a small reminder of the world that had been lost. The German soldiers and sailors who passed through Trondheim were, in the eyes of many residents, less overtly cruel than some units elsewhere. There were cases of fraternization, quiet relationships that developed between soldiers and local people, relationships born of proximity and human need rather than of genuine sympathy for the occupation. A soldier might give a child chocolate or food from his rations. These small acts of humanity existed alongside the larger machinery of occupation, and they created a kind of moral confusion that persisted in the memories of those who lived through it. How does one live with the fact that the same army that was building a weapons platform on one's doorstep occasionally showed kindness? How does one reconcile those small gestures with the larger historical reality? There was, in the community, a growing awareness that Trondheim was becoming a target. The Dora bunker, even as it was being built, was known to exist. At least its general outlines were known. The Allies had maps, had intelligence, had a good sense that something significant was happening on the Norwegian coast. This awareness permeated civilian consciousness in subtle ways. People spoke in careful tones about air raids that might come. They discussed where to hide, how to survive if the bombing started. The civilians who had built shelters or who lived closest to the fjord might lay awake at night wondering what the coming months and years would bring. And yet life continued. Shops remained open, children attended school, learning under German oversight. Weddings were celebrated, births occurred, people fell in love. Families argued about trivial matters that nonetheless felt important in the context of their constrained lives. The human capacity to maintain ordinary life even while surrounded by extraordinary circumstances is a kind of miracle, or perhaps a kind of curse. The people of Trondheim were not living in a state of constant high alert, though they were living under occupation. Most of the time, most days, they were simply trying to get by, to maintain dignity and family bonds and some small sense of normalcy in a world that had become fundamentally abnormal. The work on Dora continued throughout 1942 and into 1943, and with each passing month, the structure became more imposing, more undeniably present in the landscape. The civilians of Trondheim watched this transformation with a mixture of resignation, anxiety, and perhaps a kind of numb acceptance. This was their world now. The great fortress was being built in their fjord, by their labour and the labour of prisoners held in conditions they could glimpse but not fully know. And they lived beside it, around it, in its shadow, continuing to buy bread and tend their children and wonder, as people do in wartime, how long it would all continue. The men who came to Trondheim to crew the U-boats that would slip out into the Arctic darkness were, on the surface, ordinary sailors transformed by the grinding machinery of total war into something harder, more fractured. They arrived at the base having survived months or years of prior service, their bodies marked by the peculiar exhaustion that comes only from operating in confined spaces beneath tons of ocean, their minds carrying the weight of narrow escapes and the certain knowledge that most of their comrades would not return. What awaited them at Dora was not rest, but rather a peculiar kind of limbo, the enforced waiting between patrols, the ritual preparations, the slow compression of fear into routine. The daily rhythms of a U-boat crew at Trondheim began long before the boat itself left its pen. Each morning, men moved through the massive concrete corridors of the bunker with a kind of muted purpose, checking instruments and gauges, verifying fuel reserves, inspecting the hull for any hairline fractures or weaknesses that might compromise their lives in the depth. The Kriegsmarine had established strict protocols for these inspections, and they were followed with almost religious precision because a missed flaw could mean implosion at depth, the boat crumpling like paper in the grip of pressure. One can imagine the sound of their footsteps echoing against concrete, the whisper of compressed air in the tubes, the distant hum of diesel engines being tested and retested. The engineers would move through the boat's interior, like priests performing rites in a cathedral of steel, checking valves and seals and the intricate systems that kept the vessel functioning in an environment fundamentally hostile to human life. Between patrols, the men were housed in barracks within or near the base, accommodations that varied considerably depending on rank and seniority. Officers enjoyed relatively better quarters, small private spaces where they could retreat and, for a few hours, pretend that the ordinary rules of safety still applied. Enlisted men and junior rates shared larger dormitories, narrow bunks stacked vertically, offering little privacy and less comfort. The psychological toll of living in such close proximity to death, in spaces designed by engineers and strategists rather than for human comfort, accumulated slowly but relentlessly. A man might wake in the dark not knowing, for a moment, whether he was in the bunker or in his boat, in port or already sliding beneath the waves. The mind, under such pressure, develops strange coping mechanisms. Some men became superstitious to the point of ritual obsession. The superstitions of U-boat crews were legendary throughout the Kriegsmarine, and they took on a particular intensity at Trondheim, where the Arctic itself seemed to possess a kind of malevolent personality. Sailors would refuse to begin a patrol if a red-haired woman had been seen near the boat. Others insisted on touching a specific area of the hull before embarking, or reciting words that had become worn smooth by repetition, mantras that no longer meant anything but had come to mean everything. A man might carry a photograph in his breast pocket, taken years before of a wife or girlfriend or sister, and would touch it during moments of extreme danger, not quite believing in its protective power, but unable to imagine departing from the ritual. These were not the superstitions of ignorant men, but rather the coping strategies of intelligent, educated sailors who understood with crystalline clarity that their survival depended on factors far beyond their control or comprehension: the mood of the ocean, the positioning of Allied convoys, the reliability of their equipment, the luck that had carried them thus far and might abandon them on any given day. The routine of waiting between patrols was perhaps even more psychologically damaging than the patrols themselves. A man awaiting departure exists in a state of suspended anxiety, neither at rest nor in motion, unable to settle his mind because it keeps returning to what is coming. He knows the route his boat will take, the waters he will patrol, the likelihood of encounter with enemy vessels. He knows the names of other boats that have departed Trondheim and never returned, and his mind involuntarily calculates the odds, even as he tries to suppress such thoughts. Some men occupied themselves with letters home, writing words they hoped would survive them even if they did not. Others spent hours on the concrete dock, smoking cigarettes and watching the fjord, as if they could somehow read the future in the movement of the water. A few tried to sleep, but sleep during such periods is rarely truly restful. The mind dreams of pressure and darkness, and the terrible sensation of metal twisting. The Arctic itself exerted a peculiar psychological pressure on these men that should not be underestimated. The Arctic is not merely cold, it is indifferent to human life in a way that more temperate regions are not. In summer, the daylight persists for hours beyond the normal span, and darkness becomes a distant memory that feels almost unnatural. In winter, the opposite occurs, and the sun vanishes entirely, leaving the sky in a state of perpetual twilight or complete darkness. A U-boat operating at these latitudes during certain seasons would be operating in a region that human consciousness had not evolved to navigate. The biological rhythms that govern human sleep and wakefulness become confused. A man loses track of time. His body no longer knows when to sleep or wake. Hours blend together. The Arctic also brings ice, and ice near a U-boat is a threat of a particular kind. The sound of ice grinding against the hull creates a sensory alarm that registers in the reptilian brain, even if the conscious mind tells the sailor that the boat is beneath the ice and therefore technically safe. The U-boat crews at Trondheim, operating in these waters, experienced a form of psychological stress that modern military psychiatry would likely recognize and classify. Many of these men developed what would now be termed anxiety disorders, manifesting as chronic insomnia, hypervigilance, and a kind of emotional flattening, not quite depression, but rather a diminishment of the ability to feel joy or safety even when objectively secure. They became men of few words, their humor darkening with each patrol cycle, jokes about death and sinking becoming almost compulsively common as a way of inoculating themselves against fear through laughter. A captain might tell a joke about a U-boat sinking on the way back to port, and the crew would laugh with a desperation that suggested they were laughing partly to dispel the notion that such a fate might actually be theirs. The food at Trondheim was better than on many other German bases, a deliberate policy designed to keep the men healthy and alert, but many sailors found themselves unable to eat in the hours before departure. Their stomachs, sensing the imminence of danger in ways that their conscious minds had not yet fully registered, would close, and food would sit untouched on plates. The Kriegsmarine provided coffee and cigarettes in abundance, stimulants that were understood to be partly medicinal, partly necessary for the maintenance of basic function during long patrols. A U-boat on extended patrol would run on coffee and tobacco, and the pure momentum of training and duty, with the men operating in a state that was neither sleep nor wakefulness, but something in between, a kind of trance that the mind developed as a way of surviving the unsurvivable. Some men, after multiple patrols, would request transfers, claiming physical illness or emotional instability. The Kriegsmarine, understanding the psychological realities of submarine warfare, would sometimes grant these requests, though often only after extended psychological evaluation. Other men developed what might have been called a death wish, a fatalism that made them careless, or, conversely, hyper-focused on achieving success, as if somehow performing their duties with absolute perfection would negate the laws of probability. A few men, and the records suggest there were not many, simply broke, becoming unable to function, staring at walls in the barracks, or weeping without apparent cause. These men were removed from active service, sometimes to desk assignments, sometimes to psychiatric facilities where they received minimal care and less understanding. The bonds between men in a submarine crew were perhaps stronger than in any other military unit, because the crew existed in a state of absolute interdependence. A single mistake by a single sailor, a valve left partially open, a gauge misread, an instruction misunderstood, could kill every man on the boat. This created a kind of collective consciousness, a submarine crew existing as almost a single organism with multiple limbs and eyes and hands. The men knew each other with an intimacy that would be impossible in surface vessels. They knew each other's patterns of breathing, the sounds each man made during sleep, the small habits and rituals that marked individual identity. When men from the same boat would encounter each other in the barracks at Trondheim, they would gravitate toward one another, forming small islands of familiarity in the immense, echoing concrete spaces of Dora. A conversation between crewmates was less about exchanging information and more about confirming that they were still alive, still sane, still connected to some form of normalcy that seemed to be receding further with each passing month. As the war progressed and patrols became longer and more dangerous, the psychological toll accumulated visibly on the men who passed through Trondheim. Many developed the haunted look that was common among veterans of extreme combat, the 1,000-yard stare, as it would later be called, a gaze that seemed to be looking through the present moment into some darker future that only they could perceive. The younger men, the fresh recruits who arrived with some vestige of hope still intact, would watch the veteran crews and absorb the terrible truth of what awaited them, a kind of knowledge transfer that occurred in silence, through glances and the subtle language of the body. The question of why these men continued to volunteer, or at least continued to serve, is one that historians still contemplate. Part of it was certainly compulsion. There was no meaningful way to leave, no alternative that would not result in dire consequences. Part of it was training and professional pride, the sense that one's duty mattered, even if the cause for which one fought was itself increasingly revealed to be monstrous and lost. Part of it was the brotherhood itself, the unwillingness to abandon the men with whom one had shared danger and survived. And perhaps part of it was simply the human capacity to adapt to horror, to create meaning and routine even in the face of meaninglessness and chaos, to find ways to sleep even in the depths of the sea, to find moments of peace in the knowledge that one had done what was asked, regardless of outcome. The concrete bunker at Dora, once finished, became more than simply shelter. It became a staging ground, a launching point for men and steel into waters that few nations dared to enter, and from which, statistically, many would never return. The first U-boats to operate from Trondheim began their patrols in late 1941, and what followed was a slow, grinding campaign against the merchant convoys that threaded their way up the Norwegian coast and into the Arctic Ocean itself. Picture, if you will, a U-boat commander standing in the conning tower of his vessel as it slipped beneath the surface in the cold darkness of a northern winter night. His crew of around 40 men, cramped in steel corridors no wider than a man's shoulders, breathed air that would soon grow stale with their own exhalation. They were heading north and east, toward the Barents Sea, toward waters where the sun barely rose above the horizon, and where the ice floes drifted like the wreckage of some unfinished world. What drove men to volunteer for such service? What strange combination of patriotism, duty, and perhaps a kind of fatalism led them to accept assignments where the casualty rate by war's end would exceed 90%? The convoy routes that became their hunting grounds were themselves arteries of survival for the Soviet Union. Great Britain, despite its exhaustion and isolation, despite the German blockade that strangled its own supplies, had committed itself to sending material aid northward to Stalin's desperate armies. These were the PQ convoys, as they were designated, and later the RA convoys when returning southward, carrying empty ships or ballast. They moved through waters where the very environment seemed hostile to human life. In summer, the midnight sun cast a perpetual greyish half-light across the sea, making concealment nearly impossible for a submarine. In winter, The darkness was absolute and suffocating, but the ice and the cold claimed as many lives as any torpedo. Consider the mission of U-221, a Type Vic U-boat, which departed Trondheim in December of 1942. Its commander was searching for the eastbound convoy PQ-19, a cluster of merchant vessels struggling against both weather and the knowledge that they were moving toward one of the war's most dangerous waters. The U-boat, itself a marvel of German engineering, crept through passage after passage of open water and ice, its hydrophones straining to hear the throb of propellers, the ping of sonar, the telltale sounds of convoy escorts. For days, the crew maintained rigid silence. They slept in shifts so brief they barely constituted sleep at all. The psychological toll of such patrols was immense. The constant awareness that detection meant destruction, that a single sound made at the wrong moment could betray their position, that the odds, with each passing hour, seemed to lengthen against their survival. When a U-boat did find its target, the moment unfolded with terrible swiftness. The commander would position his vessel ahead of or to the side of the convoy, calculating angles and distances with a precision born of countless exercises and previous patrols. He would give the order to fire. A torpedo, leaving the tube with a sudden shudder and rushing through the water at speeds around 40 knots, would take perhaps several minutes to reach its target. There was a strange pause then, a waiting that seemed to stretch far longer than the actual time involved. And then, if fortune favored the hunter, a detonation. A merchant ship, perhaps carrying grain from Canada, or steel from Sweden, or explosives bound for Murmansk, would shudder as the warhead struck its hull. The torpedo's detonation would either break the ship's back outright, or begin the slower, equally fatal process of flooding. The U-boat crews from Trondheim achieved considerable success, at least for a time. Between 1942 and 1943, they sank numerous vessels, but success bred caution among the Allies. The convoys received heavier escort, including the first escort carriers, small converted merchant ships that carried a handful of anti-submarine aircraft. The skies above the convoy routes became more dangerous, and a U-boat that surfaced to recharge its batteries, a process that required approximately 15 hours per day, faced the ever-present risk of air attack. Do you wonder what it felt like, in those final moments before crash diving, to hear the roar of aircraft engines, to feel the deck vibrate beneath you, knowing that within seconds you would hear the screams of the crew as the depth charges detonated? Other missions took U-boats from Trondheim southward, into the North Atlantic proper. There, the hunting grounds shifted. Rather than convoy routes, the targets became individual merchant vessels, ships that had stragglers or that operated alone between ports. The U-boat U-601, departing from Dora in early 1943, prowled the waters between Iceland and Spitsbergen, and in a single patrol lasting nearly 2 months, claimed multiple vessels, but the survival rate of those patrols was itself becoming precarious. The Allies had begun to master anti-submarine tactics. They deployed escort groups trained to work in concert, with each vessel contributing to a coordinated defense. They developed tactics called creeping attacks, where escort vessels would approach the suspected position of a U-boat with extreme caution, minimizing the noise that their own engines produced, listening intently for any sound that might betray their prey. The crews who served aboard these submarines developed their own culture, their own superstitions. Sailors have always been prone to superstition, and submarine crews perhaps more so than most, for their lives hung by threads of chance and circumstance that they could barely control. A rabbit's foot, a lucky coin, a particular routine that had to be followed before each dive. These talismans and rituals accumulated. A submarine that had returned successfully from a patrol was considered lucky, and many crews would deliberately touch its hull or some part of it, before embarking on their own missions. There was a resignation to their sacrifice, a quiet understanding that they were part of a calculation, a sacrifice being made in service to a cause they had been taught to believe in, or perhaps simply a sacrifice accepted because they had no meaningful choice in the matter. As time wore on, the losses mounted. By 1944, the U-boat arm was in decline. The introduction of more effective radar by the Allies, the escort ships themselves becoming faster and more heavily armed, the escort carriers carrying swordfish aircraft or wildcat fighters, all of these developments conspired to shift the balance decisively against the submarines. A U-boat departing from Trondheim in the latter half of 1944 faced odds that would have seemed unthinkable in 1941 or 1942. The men who crewed them knew this, perhaps. They must have known it. And yet they still went, because orders were orders, because there was nowhere to hide from the war, because the machinery of German naval command continued to grind forward even as the foundations of the entire enterprise crumbled beneath it. The waters around Trondheim, once a zone of danger primarily for Allied shipping, gradually became dangerous instead for the U-boats themselves. Enemy forces grew stronger, more numerous, more experienced. The Arctic convoys, brutal though they were, continued to flow. The vessels that reached Murmansk and Arkhangelsk kept the Soviet war effort supplied, and the U-boats, coming back to their bunker at Dora with fewer successes, facing longer patrols into more heavily defended waters, began to disappear. Some sank without a trace, some limped home, battered and torn, with casualties among their crews, and some simply did not return at all, their fates unknown for months or years until the end of the war itself revealed, incrementally, the true magnitude of the loss. What happened to those submarines, to the men aboard them, became a kind of footnote to the larger narrative of the war. Their individual stories, each one a tragedy, a loss, a family somewhere receiving word that a son or brother or husband was missing and presumed dead, merged into larger statistical patterns, into casualty figures and tonnage sunk and damage assessment reports. Yet on the night watch, as one more U-boat slipped into the cold water and turned northward, the men aboard her would have felt, perhaps, the weight of all those prior departures, all those losses, all those waters that seemed increasingly to belong to their enemies rather than to themselves. The men and women who watched from across the sea understood something that few others grasped in those middle years of war. They knew that Trondheim, that deep-walled fortress of northern ice, held secrets, and secrets, no matter how heavily they are guarded by concrete and steel, leave traces, shadows, the particular silence of something hidden. Long before the first photographs were ever captured, before the reconnaissance cameras ever turned their precise lenses toward the Trondheim fjord, the Allies had begun to listen, not with their ears, but with the accumulated whispers of 1,000 sources. Wireless intercepts crackled into listening stations in Scotland and England, radio operators at Bletchley Park, working beneath layers of secrecy so profound that many would carry them to their graves, began to piece together fragments, a message here, a patrol report there, the routing of supply vessels, the movement of personnel. Slowly, the ghost of something enormous began to take shape in their understanding. The Kriegsmarine, you see, could not hide entirely. Every U-boat that departed Trondheim had to file reports. Every captain had to transmit, however briefly, back to command. The very radio signals that kept the fleet coordinated became, paradoxically, the thin threads by which the Allies could trace its movements. And those threads, when woven together over months, began to reveal a pattern. There was something there, something being built, something vast enough that it required constant reinforcement, constant supply, constant attention. But wireless intercepts alone were not enough. The British and American intelligence services understood that they needed to see with their own eyes. And so, beginning in 1941 and intensifying through 1942 and into 1943, the reconnaissance flights began. These were not bombing runs, they were something different and in many ways more dangerous. A single Mosquito aircraft, stripped of weapons to save weight, would climb high into the cold northern atmosphere and race across the fjord. The pilot and his camera operator would have perhaps 10 minutes, sometimes less, before German fighters scrambled from their bases. 10 minutes to photograph the mountains and the water and the slowly emerging shapes of concrete being poured into the earth. The photographs came back remarkable, grainy, yes, incomplete certainly, but revealing. Each image, when compared to the ones taken weeks or months before, showed new progress. The roof growing thicker, the wall extending further, the scale of the undertaking becoming clearer. Photo interpreters, skilled men and women who had trained themselves to read the language of shadows and geometry, began to map the bunker's dimensions. They measured with rulers on light tables. They drew conclusions from the lengths of shadows, from the positions of machinery, from the gaps in the construction where new walls were being raised. There was something almost archaeological about the work, though the archaeologists themselves would not have recognized it as such. These were the ruins of a future disaster, being documented before they were even completed. The interpreters began to understand that this was not merely a bunker. This was a fortress within a fortress. The outer walls suggested capacity for multiple submarines simultaneously. The internal structure hinted at workshops, storage, ammunition magazines. Here was a place designed to sustain U-boat operations throughout an entire winter, through storms that would turn the Arctic into a realm of ice and darkness. Yet photographs could only tell part of the story, and so the Allies turned to another source. Throughout Norway, a network had been quietly developing. Norwegian resistance cells, working with British intelligence services, had established a chain of observers along the coast. These were ordinary people, in many cases. Fishermen, lighthouse keepers, railway workers, men and women who had reasons to watch the German military installations and reasons to communicate what they saw. Some of them worked for money. Some worked for the idea of Norway. Some simply could not bear to remain passive in their own occupied homeland. This Coastwatcher network operated with extraordinary care. Information had to be gathered, memorized, and passed along through channels that were themselves constantly threatened. A message might move from a fisherman's cottage to a resistance safe house, then to a radio operator working in the dark with headphones and Morse code, tapping out words into the ether toward Stockholm or occasionally toward Britain itself. The risk was immense. If German counterintelligence discovered even a whisper of these transmissions, the consequence was interrogation, imprisonment, or execution. What these watchers reported was invaluable precisely because it was human. They could count the number of submarines that entered the fjord on a given week. They could describe the rank insignia of officers they saw on the street. They could provide information about which units were stationed where, about the arrival of new guns, about the condition of the defenses. When a new bunker began to be constructed, the network knew it. When workers arrived by the thousand, the network documented it. When the U-boats began to emerge from the completed pens and venture out into the Arctic, the network noted their departure. There were moments, one imagines, when these observers felt the weight of what they were attempting. They were ordinary people engaged in an act of extraordinary defiance, knowing that discovery meant death, and yet the reports continued to flow. The information continued to accumulate in the intelligence offices of Britain and the United States. A picture emerged, refined and sharpened with each new piece of evidence. The intelligence services began to understand not only the physical dimensions of the Dora fortress, but also something of its meaning in Hitler's strategy. This was not a random military installation. This was a symbol of permanence, of a Nazi vision of a 1,000-year Reich with its fingers reaching into the Arctic darkness. The sheer resources devoted to its construction suggested something almost desperate about the enterprise. And therein lay a strange irony. The very effort to create an unsinkable fortress became, itself, a kind of vulnerability. It drew resources, it drew attention, it became a target that could not be ignored. The British had known for some time that something extraordinary was taking shape beneath the Norwegian granite. By 1943, reconnaissance flights over the Trondheim region were returning with increasingly detailed photographs. Dark shadows in the mountainside, the geometry of blast walls, the unmistakable sprawl of a military installation unlike anything yet seen in the north. The question that kept intelligence officers awake in their London offices was not whether the Germans were building something, but whether anything could stop them from finishing it. The first Allied bombing campaign against Trondheim began in earnest in the spring of 1943, months before the Dora bunker itself was complete. The Royal Air Force and later American bomber crews understood that time was the enemy. Every month the German engineers were given felt like an eternity of advantage accumulating in concrete and steel. The raids came in waves, Lancaster bombers escorted by fighters, their bellies heavy with ordnance, crossing the North Sea under cover of darkness or the pale Arctic twilight. The crews knew what they were flying toward. They had studied the photographs, the intelligence briefings, the maps marked with flak positions and searchlight batteries. They knew also that the Germans were expecting them, that the skies above Trondheim would be a cathedral of anti-aircraft fire. One particular raid in November of 1944 would come to symbolize both the determination and the ultimate frustration of the Allied bombing effort. A force of heavy bombers, more than 30 aircraft, made their approach in formation, their bomb bay doors opening as they crossed the inner fjord. Below them, the anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their guns. The night sky erupted into a chaos of tracers, the concussive percussion of flak bursting around the fuselages, the roar of engines pushed to their limits. Bombs fell in a cascade, and in the darkness, it was impossible to know what had been struck, what had been missed. The aircraft wheeled away, 3 of them trailing smoke, and headed back toward the sea. When dawn broke over Trondheim, the damage assessments began. There were craters in the civilian areas, a warehouse destroyed, 2 apartment blocks damaged, 17 people dead in their beds. But the Dora bunker itself, now nearly complete, stood virtually unscathed. The reinforced concrete ceiling, more than 7 meters thick in places, had absorbed the impacts of the heaviest bombs available at the time. A direct hit might have penetrated, might have, though no one could say with certainty. But precision bombing at night, over a fortified target shrouded in mist and fog, was a luxury of hope rather than mathematics. The bombers did their duty, they dropped their loads, and the bunker endured. This pattern repeated itself through 1944 and into the final year of the war. RAF Mosquitoes made low-level runs at tremendous risk, their lighter bombs sometimes more effective for accuracy than the massive tonnage of the heavy bombers, but still unable to breach the shelter's defenses. American B-17s joined the effort as the strategic air campaign intensified, their long-range capabilities allowing strikes from altitudes where the flak, though terrible, was less likely to bring them down. The losses mounted. Young men, many of them barely out of their teenage years, were burned into the sky above the fjord. Their names were recorded in squadron logs and eventually in the vast archives of remembrance. They died not knowing whether their sacrifice was moving the needle toward victory or simply adding to an equation that the Germans had solved better than anyone expected. The mystery of why the Dora bunker proved so difficult to destroy speaks to a kind of engineering arrogance on the German side and a corresponding humility on the Allied. The Germans had calculated that sufficient thickness and sufficient depth would create an impenetrable fortress. They were not entirely wrong. A bunker constructed in such a manner, sunk into solid rock, its ceiling more akin to a monumental vault than a mere roof, presents a peculiar problem to aerial bombardment. You cannot dent the earth beneath it. You cannot collapse stone into itself. The bombs would have to be larger, more numerous, or precisely placed in some vulnerable aperture, and under fire, with your aircraft bouncing in the concussions of flak, under the hazing pressure of knowing that German fighters might be climbing to intercept you, precision became a word that belonged in peacetime textbooks. By the autumn of 1944, some of the bombing raids were being mounted not out of any realistic expectation of destroying the bunker, but rather to keep the Germans occupied with repairs, to prevent the steady flow of U-boats from being as efficient as it might otherwise be, to maintain a constant pressure that would fray nerves and burn fuel, and demand 1,000 small decisions from commanders who were already stretched thin. It was a strategy of friction, not seeking a sudden, dramatic destruction, but instead trying to make every day more difficult than the last, trying to hasten the moment when fuel ran out and the will to continue began to fragment. The Germans responded to these raids with a mixture of pride and anxiety. The Dora bunker became a symbol of their determination, but also of their siege mentality. Every air raid siren, every night spent in shelters, every morning surveying the damage to the surrounding city, it all served as a reminder that the war was slipping away, that the distances between their fortress and the Allied lines were growing shorter, not longer. The bunker that was supposed to be unsinkable was becoming a tomb of increasingly obsolete hopes. Some accounts suggest that certain raids came closer than others to catastrophic damage. There were near misses, bomb craters that opened the earth like wounds only meters from the bunker's entrance structures. The Norwegian workers and forced labourers who remained in the area spoke in hushed tones of the terrible noise, the shaking of the ground, the sense that the whole mountain might come down. But the mountain did not come down. The bunker held. And in its holding, it became not a symbol of German strength, but of German desperation. A last, elaborate, defiant gesture against a tide that could not be turned by concrete or steel, or the courage of men who simply did not have time left to imagine anything else. Yet even as Dora rose from the fjord's rocky shore, its massive concrete crown emerging month by month through 1942 and into 1943, the architects of Hitler's Arctic fortress understood a fundamental truth, that the best single bunker, however impenetrable, remained only one piece of a far larger puzzle. The question that haunted the German naval planners in those long northern nights was not simply whether one bastion could withstand bombardment, but whether an entire defensive system, woven across the entire Trondheim fjord and its surrounding waters, could create an environment so hostile, so layered with interlocking threats, that no enemy submarine or surface vessel could approach the base itself. And so, even before Dora reached completion, the decision was made to begin construction on a second bunker, codenamed Dora 2, positioned several kilometers away on a different fjord arm, serving as both backup facility and distributed insurance against total loss. Dora 2 never achieved the ambition of its elder sibling. The plans were drawn with similar grandiosity: reinforced concrete, deep excavation, capacity for maintenance and supply operations, but the resources that might have built it to full scale were increasingly diverted elsewhere as the German war machine found itself fighting on multiple fronts with dwindling material flows. Still, work proceeded through 1943 and 1944, and the project consumed prisoners of war, forced labourers, and local Norwegian conscripts, adding another layer of suffering to the civilian population who watched their homeland transformed into a garrison state. The sites were connected not by roads visible to enemy reconnaissance, but by careful routing through tunnels and hidden paths, a subterranean network that made Trondheim less a single installation than a sprawling, interconnected warren of concrete and steel. But Dora I and Dora II were merely the heart of something vastly more complex. Around them, radiating outward in concentric rings of defended space, the Germans constructed what military historians would later describe as one of the most elaborate coastal fortress systems in all of occupied Europe. Consider for a moment the geography itself. Trondheim fjord is not a simple waterway, but a complex system of deeper channels, shallower arms, islands, and peninsulas that could be defended or blocked in countless ways. The Germans seized upon this natural labyrinth and weaponized it. Anti-aircraft batteries, or flak towers, were positioned on elevated positions overlooking the fjord's primary approaches. These were not crude emplacements, but fortified gun positions with concrete reinforcement, ammunition storage built into cliff faces, and command posts linked by buried telephone lines to a central fire control center. By late 1943, estimates suggest there were over 100 anti-aircraft guns arrayed in clusters around Trondheim, ranging from smaller 37mm pieces to massive 88mm guns capable of engaging aircraft at considerable altitude and range. The fjord itself was sealed against underwater intrusion in ways that combined medieval and modern engineering in unexpected ways. The Germans laid extensive minefields across the main shipping channels, not crude surface mines, but sophisticated anti-submarine nets and contact mines, positioned at depths calculated to catch submarines either entering or departing. These were not merely defensive measures, they were psychological weapons as well, transforming the fjord into a maze that demanded respect and careful navigation even from vessels of the German Navy itself. Maintenance of these systems fell to specialized crews, men who worked in small boats and diving suits in waters so cold that exposure measured in minutes could be fatal. They moved through the silence of the fjord with knowledge that a single mistake, a single drifting mine, or overlooked obstacle could mean the difference between life and death for the U-boat crews depending on these defenses. Complementing the minefields and gun positions was a network of observation posts and radar stations that represented the cutting edge of German detection technology, though its effectiveness was often overstated by commanders eager to assure Berlin that their fortresses were truly impregnable. The radar installations were positioned on high ground, swept constantly across the Barents Sea and toward the Arctic, scanning for the approach of enemy aircraft or ships. These stations were, themselves, prime targets for Allied bombing raids, and so they too were protected, ringed with flak batteries and blast walls, creating smaller fortress-within-fortress configurations that repeated the defensive pattern at multiple scales. The command networks connecting these various elements, the radar stations, the gun batteries, the lookout posts, represented years of careful planning and the painstaking installation of thousands of kilometers of telephone cable, much of it buried to protect it from air attack. One might ask why such elaborate defenses were deemed necessary for a single base, and the answer reveals much about the German mentality in the middle years of the war. By 1943, Allied air power had grown to a scale that made any fixed installation vulnerable to determined attack. The bombing of German cities was mounting in intensity and success. The Americans flew daylight precision raids. The British struck at night, and neither seemed capable of being stopped by conventional defenses alone. In Trondheim, the German commanders believed that by creating not one invulnerable target, but dozens of interlocking and mutually supporting positions, they could achieve something close to invulnerability through redundancy and depth. If one flak battery was destroyed, two others covered its sector. If one minefield was swept, three others remained unseen. If one bunker was damaged, another stood ready. This philosophy led to extraordinary expenditure of resources and labor, resources that might have been deployed elsewhere with greater strategic effect. The construction of this wider defensive network required the exploitation of Norwegian civilian labor on a truly staggering scale. Young Norwegian men and women, some conscripted, others coerced, many desperate simply to feed their families in a time of occupation and rationing, found themselves working on defense installations they despised, under German supervision, with the full knowledge that they were strengthening the occupation that oppressed them. The work was backbreaking, moving rubble, pouring concrete, hauling ammunition and supplies up mountain paths, and it happened in plain sight, visible to the Norwegian population of Trondheim and the surrounding districts. The presence of these construction sites, the visible expansion of German military might, created a strange and complex emotional landscape. There was resentment, certainly, but there was also a peculiar form of local pride in the sheer audacity and scale of what was being built. A fortress that defied imagination, that seemed designed to resist the gods themselves, was rising in their fjord, and whether one supported the Germans or despised them, the evidence was inescapable. The flak batteries themselves deserve a moment of attention, for they represented something more than mere weapons. They were communities of a sort, small garrisons of young men, many of them conscripts from the Luftwaffe, living in prefabricated barracks, scattered across the heights overlooking Trondheim fjord. These gun crews developed their own rhythms and routines, their own superstitions and social hierarchies, not unlike the U-boat crews at the bunker below. They rotated through periods of intense alert, when every aircraft might be enemy, and long stretches of boredom, when they maintained their weapons, practiced their drills, and endured the relentless cold and wind of the Trondheim winter. The psychological toll of this existence, the constant expectation of attack that rarely came, the knowledge that when the enemy did come it might be overwhelming, wore on men's minds in ways that official reports rarely captured. Letters home spoke of loneliness, of the strange beauty of the Arctic landscape, of a growing sense that the war was drifting beyond their control, that all these fortifications and weapons, impressive as they were, might not be sufficient. And the minefields deserve reflection as well. Modern underwater archaeology and naval history have revealed that the German mine-laying operations around Trondheim were both more and less effective than contemporary assessments suggested. More effective in that they genuinely did constrain the movement of ships and submarines through the fjord, and several vessels were indeed lost to mines. Less effective because the sophistication and density of the fields, while impressive on paper and in the reports filed by German admirals, was often less complete than assumed. Mines drifted, mines failed to detonate, weather and current created gaps in coverage that remained undetected. Norwegian fishermen and, later, Norwegian resistance members accumulated knowledge of safe passages that the Germans never quite managed to eliminate. The minefields became as much psychological theatre as military reality, a manifestation of German determination to turn their Norwegian domain into an unconquerable fortress, even as the material reality of total war began to show its strain on resources and manpower. The wider network of defences, taken together, represented an investment in security and deterrence that consumed an enormous quantity of resources that might have been deployed in offensive operations or in shoring up other parts of the German defence perimeter. This was, perhaps, the final and most subtle success of the Allies against the Trondheim complex. By its very existence and apparent strength, it exerted a kind of gravitational pull on German military thinking and material allocation. Resources flowed to Trondheim that might have gone elsewhere. Men served in guard battalions and flak crews around the fjord when they might have reinforced fronts in Russia or the Mediterranean. Supplies arrived in Trondheim to stock the bunkers and defend the approaches when those same supplies might have filled other pressing needs. The fortress that Hitler envisioned as the impregnable gateway to his northern fortress became, in a strange way, a drain on the very power it was meant to protect. And yet, beneath the oppressive shadow of the bunker, beneath the swastika flags and the grinding machinery of occupation, something else moved through Trondheim and the surrounding valleys, something quieter, more elusive, harder to fortify against. The Norwegian resistance, which would grow from scattered acts of individual courage into a coordinated network of sabotage and intelligence gathering, understood something fundamental that the Germans, for all their engineering brilliance, could never quite grasp: that a concrete fortress is only as strong as the people who must live around it, and people, even under occupation, retain the capacity to resist. In the early years after 1940, resistance in Norway was fragmented, almost tentative. Small groups of young men, sometimes teenagers, would make their way into the forests with little more than homemade explosives and a burning need to strike back at the machinery of occupation. Many were caught, many were executed, but the knowledge that it was possible to act, that defiance was not futile, spread quietly through the population like frost creeping across a window pane. And as the Dora bunker rose from the rock and concrete of the Trondheim fjord, so too did the awareness that this installation represented something worth the extraordinary risk of trying to destroy. One of the most intriguing aspects of Norwegian resistance near Trondheim involved what historians sometimes call the intelligence war. The careful, meticulous work of coast watchers, railway workers, dock labourers, and ordinary citizens who could observe German movements and relay information to the Allies and to Norwegian command cells operating in Sweden. A railway worker, for instance, might note the frequency of U-boat traffic entering and leaving the fjord. A dock administrator, sympathetic to the cause, might overhear conversations about supply shipments or personnel rotations. A fisherman, moving along the dark northern coastline, might spot evidence of new construction or the arrival of military equipment. These observations, gathered patiently and at considerable personal risk, formed the sinews of an intelligence network that no amount of concrete and steel could fully obscure. The resistance also understood that the bunker itself, for all its imposing scale, relied on a fragile network of supply lines, power infrastructure, and human coordination. Sabotage, therefore, was not always about direct assault on the fortress. It was about disrupting the systems that kept it alive. Railway lines that carried materials to Trondheim became targets of careful planning. Electrical installations that powered cranes and pumps were noted for future disruption. Fuel depots and ammunition stores, scattered across the region, became the focus of reconnaissance. It required patience, intelligence, and an intimate knowledge of the landscape that the occupiers, despite their maps and surveys, could never fully possess. There were, of course, more dramatic moments. In 1942 and 1943, there were documented attempts at direct sabotage against German installations around Trondheim, though the heavily fortified nature of the bunker itself made it a particularly difficult target. The resistance was acutely aware that any major action near Dora would bring swift and devastating retaliation. The Germans had learned well the consequences of underestimating resistance movements. They responded to sabotage with mass arrests, hostage executions, and collective punishment that fell indiscriminately upon the surrounding civilian population. This created a terrible calculus for those planning resistance actions. The potential damage to German war-making capability had to be weighed against the certainty of suffering inflicted on innocent people. And so much of the resistance effort, especially as the war continued and the bunker became more solidly entrenched, turned inward, toward acts of quiet defiance that did not immediately invite reprisals. A factory worker might deliberately slow production, introducing small defects into components destined for U-boats. A Norwegian official, working within the German administrative apparatus, might quietly redirect resources or delay orders. A nurse might tend to wounded Norwegian resistance fighters in secret. A schoolteacher might preserve Norwegian language and culture in ways the occupiers sought to suppress. These acts seem small in isolation, almost invisible, and yet they constituted a form of resistance that no fortification could defeat, because it operated not through violence, but through the accumulated choices of thousands of individuals to refuse full compliance, to maintain their humanity and their allegiance to something beyond the Third Reich. The relationship between the civilian population of Trondheim and the military apparatus being constructed in their midst was, necessarily, complex and fraught. Some workers had no choice but to labor on the bunker itself. Compulsion, economic necessity, the simple need to feed one's family. Others volunteered, either from ideological conviction or pragmatic calculation. And yet even among those who worked on Dora, there were instances of subtle resistance. A worker might deliberately position reinforcing steel in ways that created structural weaknesses invisible to German inspectors. Another might leave tools or materials in places where they could be found and used by saboteurs. These acts were extraordinarily dangerous. Discovery could mean execution, but they reveal something about human nature that the regime's planners seemed perpetually unable to account for. The persistence of conscience, the quiet rebellion of those who retained the capacity to distinguish between obedience and collaboration. Norwegian historians, particularly those who have studied the resistance in the Trondheim region, often speak of how the resistance became increasingly sophisticated and organized as the war progressed. By 1943 and 1944, there were actual military command structures, training programs, weapons caches hidden in the mountains, and detailed plans for armed uprising should the Germans ever attempt to march the population into forced evacuation or internment camps. The bunker, in a certain sense, became both a target of this growing military preparation and a symbol of the extremity of occupation that was driving more and more Norwegians toward active resistance. The more elaborate and imposing the German fortifications became, the more it drove home the reality that Norway was not a willingly integrated part of the Third Reich, but a conquered territory held down by force. There is a particular poignancy in contemplating these acts of resistance in the context of the bunker. Dora was meant to be unsinkable, impregnable, a monument to German technological superiority and strategic vision, and yet it was surrounded, quite literally, by a population that was slowly, persistently, in ways both visible and invisible, working to undo everything it represented. The fortress could not wall out the quiet determination of those who refused to accept the premise of permanent German rule. In this sense, the very imposingness of the bunker became a kind of unintended advertisement of German vulnerability. For why build such elaborate defenses unless one feared, at some level, that the occupation could not be sustained by willing cooperation alone? By the autumn of 1944, the Trondheim base existed in a state of slow erosion, though those inside it did not yet understand the word that history would apply to their situation. The U-boats still lay in their pens, the bunker's concrete still held. But the waters that had once brought them fuel and supplies now brought almost nothing at all. And somewhere in the back of every officer's mind, a question had begun to form, quietly and without permission. How much longer could this continue? The Reich's fuel situation had become catastrophic. The great synthetic oil plants of central Germany were now rubble, bombed relentlessly by Allied air raids that seemed to come without warning and without mercy. The natural oil fields of Romania, once a lifeline, had fallen to the Soviet advance, and the tankers that might have carried fuel northward to the Arctic bases were themselves disappearing, sunk by submarines and Allied naval forces in the Atlantic. What did arrive at Trondheim came in diminishing quantities, enough perhaps to maintain a skeleton fleet, but not enough to sustain the vision of Arctic dominance that had once animated the base's construction. For the U-boat crews themselves, the transition was both subtle and profound. In the early months of the base's operation, there had been a certain grim pride in serving in Hitler's northernmost fortress. The Arctic patrols were dangerous, yes, but they were purposeful. The convoys bringing supplies to the Soviet Union were targets worth pursuing, and some boats returned with success stories. Merchant vessels sunk, reports filed, the machinery of war still turning. But by late 1944, the nature of those patrols had shifted. Fuel became too precious to spend on long-range hunting. The boats that left Trondheim now often turned back early, conscious of the mathematics of survival. How could one hunt prey when the hunter himself was starving? The German Naval Command, in its decreasing desperation, began to conceive of the U-boats not as weapons of offense, but as weapons of last resort. Plans were drawn up for the deployment of new, revolutionary submarine types, the Type 21, which could dive deeper and move faster than any vessel yet built. Some of these advanced boats were intended for the Arctic theatre. There was talk, in the quieter corners of the base's headquarters, of a final defensive strategy, a last stand perhaps, if the Allies moved against Scandinavia. But these were the fantasies of men who no longer controlled their own fate. Throughout 1945, the mood in Trondheim darkened with the seasons. Winter came early and stayed late, as it always did, but now the cold seemed to carry a different weight. Supply ships arrived less frequently. The crews aboard the U-boats grew thinner and more hollow-eyed. Officers who had once projected confidence now spoke in careful, measured tones. The newspapers that circulated through the base, Nazi propaganda sheets, all of them, spoke of inevitable victory and secret weapons, but the men reading them knew the language of a sinking power. They had learned to read between the lines. By February and March, the situation had become untenable. The Soviet advance from the east was measured in kilometers per day. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. The Third Reich, which had once seemed built to last 1,000 years, was contracting visibly, its borders shrinking like a wound closing inward. And in Trondheim, the U-boat crews and the men of the base found themselves isolated, far from the collapsing center of German power, in a fortress that now seemed less like a bastion and more like a tomb. The submarine force itself was being decimated in these final months, though not primarily by enemy action. The boats that ventured out from Trondheim and other Arctic bases now faced a combination of hazards: fuel shortages that made long voyages impossible, mechanical failures that could not be adequately repaired due to the scarcity of parts, and the simple reality that the waters around Norway were growing more heavily patrolled by Allied vessels. Some boats were ordered not to sail at all, their crews repurposed as dock workers or enlisted into makeshift infantry units. There was something deeply demoralizing about this transition, the transformation of elite U-boat crews into land soldiers in a desperate cause they no longer believed would succeed. The bunker itself, paradoxically, had never been more complete. The Dora complex stood finished and formidable, its massive concrete roof impervious to bombs, its internal infrastructure capable of supporting dozens of submarines. But what was the use of an unsinkable fortress when the fleet it was built to shelter was dissolving? What good were impenetrable pens when there was no fuel to power the boats that rested inside them? And yet, beneath this surface despair, there persisted a strange kind of momentum, the inertia of an institution that had become so vast and so embedded in its landscape that it could not simply cease to exist. Officers still filed reports. Maintenance crews still performed their duties. Supplies were still requisitioned, though they arrived in ever smaller quantities. There is something almost hypnotic about the way a great military organization can continue its routines even as the ground beneath it crumbles. The machinery grinds on, not because anyone truly believes in what it is doing, but because the machinery has become a kind of life in itself, demanding to be fed and maintained simply because it exists. In April, word came down through the chain of command that the war in Europe was entering its final phase. Germany was surrounded, conquered from east and west. The Nazi regime itself was fragmenting, with different commanders and different commands issuing contradictory orders. Some voices demanded that the bases in Norway hold to the last man. Others spoke of orderly withdrawals and surrenders, and in this confusion, the men of Trondheim, soldiers, sailors, dock workers, the remnants of once proud units, found themselves suspended between one world that was dying and another that had not yet been born. The U-boats that had once represented the cutting edge of German technological prowess now sat in their concrete cradles, magnificent and useless. Some would never move again, others would be scuttled by their own crews, sent to the bottom of the fjord rather than surrendered intact to an enemy. And the great bunker, that monument to Nazi ambition and engineering, would change hands not through assault or siege, but through a simple, almost bureaucratic act of surrender. The cold fjord waters remained ice-free, as they always did, even as the world froze around them. By the spring of 1945, the machinery of the Third Reich was no longer grinding forward. It was simply grinding to a halt, like a great engine running on fumes and wishful thinking. In Trondheim, officers of the Kriegsmarine Naval Command had begun, in those final weeks, to contemplate something they had spent 6 years refusing to contemplate: the prospect of defeat. The bunker called Dora, that supposed impregnable fortress carved into Norwegian bedrock, stood largely complete in its physical form, its vast concrete chambers ready to shelter U-boats from any conceivable assault from above. Yet the U-boats themselves were growing scarce. Fuel was rationed to a severity that made training impossible. Crews sat idle in those echoing halls, waiting for orders that seemed increasingly to dissolve into mere rumor, and the broader military situation had, by April, become unmistakably catastrophic. Soviet forces were pushing westward. Allied armies had crossed the Rhine. Berlin itself was under siege. Still, the German military authorities in Norway clung to the notion that the war might somehow be salvaged, or at the very least prolonged. Hitler's directives from his bunker in Berlin, as late as April 20th, suggested that Fortress Norway, the northernmost bulwark of the Reich, must be held at all costs. But the men on the ground in Trondheim, many of them career naval officers who understood the mathematics of total defeat, knew better. What followed in those final days was a strange, quiet evacuation of certainty. Officers began destroying or burying sensitive documents. Some began contemplating escape routes to Sweden. Others simply waited, day by day, for news from the south that never came soon enough. The Dora bunker itself, so recently a symbol of Nazi technical superiority and unshakable resolve, had become something altogether different, a tomb of ambition, a monument to strategies that would never be completed, a fortress with no one left to defend it. The war in Europe ended, effectively, on May 7, 1945, when Germany signed its unconditional surrender. In Norway, the news reached Trondheim with an almost unreal quality. After 5 years of occupation and militarization, after the construction of Dora and the fortification of the entire fjord system, the war was simply over. No dramatic last stand, no heroic last-ditch defense of the Arctic fortress. simply a signing of papers in rands. And suddenly, the entire strategic logic that had sustained the German military presence in Norway became void. What happened next was, in many ways, more surreal than any battle would have been. The German command in Norway, particularly in Trondheim, faced an unprecedented situation. They still possessed, technically, a fully operational U-boat base with modern facilities. The bunker was one of the most sophisticated concrete structures in the world. The harbour defences, the flak batteries, the minefields in the fjord, all of it remained in place, still formidable, still dangerous. But they had no authority to use any of it. They were no longer soldiers of the Reich. They were, technically, prisoners of war awaiting internment and, potentially, trial. The question of what to do with Dora became, almost immediately, a matter of international military protocol. Norwegian forces, operating under the aegis of the newly restored Norwegian government in exile, began to move toward Trondheim to accept the German surrender and take possession of the military installations. British naval forces were also present in Norwegian waters, keen to ensure that German naval assets did not attempt any last-moment sabotage or escape. The handover itself was negotiated with a courtesy and formality that seems almost otherworldly when one considers the context. German officers, in dress uniform, met with Norwegian military representatives in what had, just days before, been enemy territory. Flags were lowered, ceremonial gestures were exchanged, and slowly, the vast bunker called Dora, still incomplete in some respects, still filled with the tools and materials of its construction, passed from German to Norwegian hands. What emerged from this process was something that the original planners of Dora had never truly imagined. The bunker would survive the war intact, structurally unharmed, its massive concrete shell entirely undamaged by the bombs that had rained down on other German military installations across Europe. In some ways, this very intactness became a kind of monument to the futility of the entire enterprise. Here was this extraordinary feat of engineering, constructed at an enormous human cost, powered by the suffering of tens of thousands of forced labourers, designed to be the ultimate expression of German military invulnerability in the Arctic. And in the end, it had been surrendered without a single shot fired in its defence. The Norwegian authorities who took possession of the facility found themselves in a peculiar position. The Dora bunker was, in technological terms, one of the most advanced military installations on the continent. It was also, given the scale of its construction and the resources devoted to it, potentially one of the most expensive monuments to waste in the entire war. What use could a small Scandinavian nation possibly have for an U-boat bunker designed to shelter vessels that would never again fire a torpedo in earnest? In those first confused months after the surrender, the bunker sat largely empty, its corridors and chambers echoing with an eerie silence broken only by the footsteps of caretakers and the occasional creak of cooling concrete as the massive structure began its long adjustment to peace. The German personnel, officers, engineers, enlisted men, began, in stages, to be processed as prisoners of war. Some were marched away relatively quickly. Others remained in Trondheim for weeks or even months, helping to document the condition of the installations, and in some cases, assisting with the technical assessment of the bunker itself. A few of the high-ranking officers who had overseen the project's management faced interrogation and, eventually, far more serious consequences. The question of Nazi guilt and war crimes was not abstract when it came to Dora. The bunker's construction had been carried out by enslaved workers, Russian prisoners of war, Yugoslavs, Poles, and others, who had suffered immensely. Records were incomplete, and many who had worked on the bunker had simply disappeared into the chaos of those final months of the war. So the careful, methodical process of accounting for what had happened, of documenting the names of those who had died, and those who had survived, fell to the Norwegian authorities and later to international war crimes investigators. The bunker itself thus became, inadvertently, a kind of vast courtroom, a physical space where evidence of the regime's brutality could be recorded and preserved. One of the strangest aspects of the transition was the question of what the bunker was literally constructed from. The reinforced concrete that made up its walls and roof, some sections more than 7 meters thick, had been mixed with the labor of thousands. The precision engineering, the electrical systems, the ventilation infrastructure designed to allow U-boats to shelter safely from aerial bombardment, all of it was the product of meticulous German planning executed by German engineers and carried out by enslaved workers who had, in many cases, left parts of themselves, their blood, their sweat, their final breaths, in that concrete. This became a difficult, unspoken reality as Norwegian caretakers walked through the bunker in those first years after the war. The structure they were now responsible for protecting and maintaining was simultaneously a feat of human engineering and a tomb, a monument to what the darker impulses of industrial civilization, when harnessed to totalitarian ideology, could accomplish. There is a quality to the surrender of Trondheim and the handover of Dora that deserves a moment of quiet contemplation. No great drama attended it, no last stand, no dramatic destruction of the bunker to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, something the German High Command, given their obsessive concern with its strategic importance, might have ordered. Instead, it simply changed hands, like a building whose lease had expired. The war, which had seemed, in the bunker's early phases of construction, like it might rage forever, which had seemed to demand an eternal Arctic fortress staffed by eternal U-boat crews, had ended with almost shocking abruptness, and the bunker remained, indestructible, waiting for new purposes, waiting for new meanings, waiting for a future that none of its designers, German or enslaved, could have predicted. When the German forces surrendered in May of 1945, the Dora bunker remained, in many ways, exactly as it had been conceived, a structure so formidable, so deeply rooted into the living rock of the Norwegian fjord, that no amount of defeat could diminish its physical presence. The Norwegian commanders who entered that grey concrete cavern in the weeks following capitulation must have felt something between awe and unease, standing in rooms designed by an enemy now vanished, surrounded by the machinery of a war that had consumed 6 years and millions of lives. The bunker was not destroyed. It was not dismantled. It simply waited. For a brief period in those immediate post-war months, there was genuine uncertainty about what Norway would do with this architectural ghost. Some voices argued for demolition, a symbolic erasure of the Nazi occupation and all its instruments. But such an undertaking would have proven prohibitively expensive, and more pragmatically, the Norwegian Navy began to recognize that the structure, whatever its origins, possessed qualities that made it far too valuable to simply erase. The thick concrete walls that had protected German U-boats could just as easily protect Norwegian vessels. The underground moorings, the fuel storage systems, the intricate network of passages carved into the mountain. These were not inherently evil. They were simply infrastructure, rendered neutral by circumstance and the passage of time. So Dora was repurposed, not immediately, and not without a certain measured hesitation in the Norwegian consciousness, but gradually the bunker transitioned from a monument to Nazi ambition into a functioning naval facility for the Norwegian military. By the late 1940s, Norwegian crews had begun cataloguing what they had inherited, removing German signage, scrubbing away the most visible reminders of occupation. Yet the bones of the structure remained unchanged. You could still see, if you knew where to look, the cable channels laid down for German communications systems, the reinforced steel doors, still bore the marks of German manufacture. The blast-proof construction that had been engineered to withstand Allied bombs remained perfectly intact. The Cold War, in many ways, gave Dora a second life. As tensions between NATO and the Soviet Union hardened through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Norway found itself in an increasingly precarious position, a NATO member sharing a long border with Soviet territory, sitting at the very apex of European geopolitics. The Dora bunker, with its unmatched defensive properties and its strategic position overlooking the Trondheim approaches, suddenly seemed less like a relic of a defeated enemy and more like a prudent insurance policy against the new threats massing in the east. Norwegian military planners dusted off their maps and their long-term strategic thinking, and Dora began to evolve once again. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the facility was gradually modernized. New equipment replaced the German-era machinery that had fallen into disrepair. The bunker's internal systems were updated to reflect contemporary naval needs, though the fundamental architecture, that massive concrete ceiling, those deep passages into the mountain, remained as the Germans had conceived it. One might ask whether this constituted a kind of reuse or a kind of haunting. A haunting, perhaps, wherein the spectre of the original purpose could never quite be laid entirely to rest, no matter how thoroughly the Norwegians swept and repainted and updated the systems running through those corridors. The facility served throughout the Cold War as a significant naval installation, though its exact operational role remained classified for decades. What is now known, through declassification and historical records, is that Dora housed Norwegian naval vessels, served as a command center for coastal defense operations, and functioned as a storage facility for munitions and fuel supplies. The strategic logic was sound and, in a sense, inevitable. A bunker designed to be unsinkable by the Allies of 1944 would prove equally resistant to any threat the Soviets might pose during the decades that followed. The mountain itself became the defense. But strange things happen to places when their original purpose has been erased and a new purpose imposed upon them. Some historians and military archivists who have studied the facility note an almost dreamlike quality in its post-war existence. The way the structure continued to function in near-perfect isolation from the outside world, how crews worked in those concrete caverns under lights, following routines and protocols, seemingly untouched by the civilian life that existed mere kilometers away in Trondheim proper. One might imagine Norwegian sailors descending into those passages and, for a moment, encountering a ghost of the facility as it was, the echo of German voices, the memory of a different war, though such moments would have been brief and unspoken. The bunker's role gradually diminished through the 1970s and 1980s as Norwegian defense strategy evolved and as the Navy developed newer, more mobile capabilities, yet it was never entirely abandoned. Smaller naval units continued to use it, personnel still maintained its systems, and the mountain remained Norwegian sovereign territory, filled with equipment and possibility. There was no clear moment of closure, no formal decommissioning ceremony. Instead, there was a slow fade, much like the light that filters down into a deep fjord on a winter afternoon, present, but growing ever more distant and difficult to perceive. In the decades following the Cold War's end, the facility's status entered a kind of liminal space. Parts of the bunker were gradually opened to civilian use. Tourist groups began to pass through certain sections, walking the same corridors where German officers had once planned Arctic patrols, where Norwegian sailors had maintained vigil against Soviet submarines. What had been absolutely secret for so long became, at least partially, a monument to history itself. The Norwegian Navy eventually reduced its active operations at the site, though military use has never entirely ceased. Some installations from the Nazi era remain in military hands, Others have been handed over to local municipalities or cultural organizations. Today, Dora stands as perhaps the most remarkable physical artifact of the Nazi occupation in Scandinavia. The bunker has not been destroyed or demolished. It has not, in the way that many occupied structures have been carefully preserved as a museum dedicated entirely to its history. Rather, it exists in a state of productive ambiguity, partly a historical site, partly still functioning infrastructure, partly the domain of tourists and local residents who have learned to live alongside this enormous, unavoidable reminder of the war years. The concrete has weathered. The mountain around it has weathered. The facility continues, year after year, to resist the kind of decay and degradation that affects most structures built by human hands. What makes Dora's survival particularly remarkable is its very durability, the quality that made it so formidable as a Nazi fortress in the first place. The thick reinforced concrete, now more than 80 years old, shows astonishingly little structural deterioration. The passages remain stable. The ventilation systems, modernized repeatedly over the decades, continue to function. One might say that the bunker has become, in a strange way, a testament not to the ideology that built it, but to the ingenuity of its construction, the soundness of its engineering. The mountain shelters it still, as it always has, indifferent to the wars and peace that have come and gone around it. There exists, in recent years, growing interest in Dora as a historical and cultural site, a place where the material reality of the occupation can be tangibly encountered. Local museums in Trondheim have begun organizing more detailed tours through certain sections of the bunker. Historical researchers have gained access to archives and to the facility itself, beginning the long work of documenting exactly what happened within those walls, the names of the laborers who built it, the details of the daily routines that sustained the German base. This archaeological work of memory is, in many ways, as important as the physical structure itself. The bunker without the human stories is merely concrete and steel. The bunker with those stories recovered becomes something closer to truth. And so Dora endures, a strange and solemn monument not to Nazi power that passed away decades ago, but to the remarkable resilience of human engineering, to the way that structures built for one purpose can be quietly converted to another, and another still, and perhaps eventually to purposes that their original creators could never have imagined. In this slow transformation from fortress to naval facility to historical site lies a kind of redemption, though perhaps not the kind that comes with forgetting. Rather, it is the kind that comes with remembering, with returning again and again to the cold concrete passages and asking, what happened here? Who suffered here? And how do we, living now in peace, honor the lives that were lost or broken in the building of this impossible, indestructible place? Behind the grey concrete walls of Dora, behind every rivet and every reinforced ceiling that turned away Allied bombs, there lived a silence that no engineering could ever truly contain. It is a silence that belongs to the men and women whose names were never recorded in the Wehrmacht's careful ledgers, whose labor made the fortress possible, and whose bodies bore the cost of Hitler's Arctic ambition in ways that statistics and historical documents have only begun to reveal. The construction of Dora consumed not merely materials and time, but human beings. Among the forced laborers who arrived in Trondheim between 1943 and 1944 were prisoners of war from across occupied Europe, Russian soldiers, Polish conscripts, Norwegian resistors who had been captured. There were also deportees, civilians seized from their homes in France and Belgium, conscripted into labor gangs and transported northward under guard toward a project they did not understand until they arrived at the fjord. Many came believing they would be home within months. None of them were. The work itself was relentless and without mercy. In the darkness of the Trondheim fjord winter, men labored underground and on exposed rock faces, drilling and blasting to create the vast chamber that would shelter U-boats. The stone was unforgiving. The cold was absolute. There was little adequate clothing, less adequate food. The guards, a mixture of Wehrmacht soldiers and Norwegian collaborators, enforced discipline with rifle butts and threat. Escape was impossible. The base was surrounded by water and sentries. Resistance meant execution. Compliance meant slow starvation and disease, watching your body grow hollow as the months passed. The records that exist are fragmentary. Different sources count the labor force variously, perhaps 3,000 at the peak of construction, perhaps higher. Among them, the death toll remains uncertain, which itself is a kind of tragedy. Historians have estimated between 200 and 400 forced laborers died at Trondheim during the bunker's construction, though the true number may never be known. Some perished from hunger and disease in the barracks. Others were killed in accidents, falls from heights, collapse of unsupported walls, machinery that caught limbs and crushed them. A few were executed for resistance or attempted escape. Their bodies were disposed of quietly, recorded in logs that have mostly vanished, if they were recorded at all. Among the prisoners were men whose names have slowly emerged from archives and survivor testimonies. There was a Soviet officer whose journal fragment survived, describing the day he first saw the Atlantic Ocean from a work detail on the fjord's edge, and how that view, of a world beyond the wire, nearly broke him. There was a French engineer, deported from Lyon, who managed to hide scraps of paper on which he sketched the bunker's layout, a testimony he hoped would reach the Allies, though it remained hidden for decades. There were Polish brothers who arrived together and died within weeks of one another, their shared grave somewhere in the frozen ground they had been forced to excavate. What remains most poignant is the ordinary anonymity of their suffering. These were not generals or politicians whose legacies would be written into history books. They were ordinary men, farmers, factory workers, teachers, students, who had the misfortune to be in the wrong place when German soldiers came. They left behind families who never fully learned what became of them. They left behind letters never sent, conversations never finished, futures that would never arrive. In the decades after the war, as Trondheim rebuilt itself and moved forward, the memory of those who had died in or near Dora was largely absorbed into the broader trauma of occupation and war. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that historians and survivor groups began to systematically gather testimonies from those who had lived through the labor camps. By then, many witnesses were elderly, their memories fragmented by trauma and time. Some survivors never wished to speak of it again. Others, when they did, spoke with a kind of restrained precision, naming dates, describing meals, recounting small acts of kindness that had kept them alive, as if the particularity of detail could somehow honor those who had not survived to speak. Today, the memorials to that suffering are quiet and, if you do not know to look for them, easy to pass by unnoticed. There is a small stone marker placed near one of the labor barracks sites, now overgrown and difficult to access. The inscription is in Norwegian and Russian, naming some, only some, of those who died. Beside it, visitors sometimes leave flowers in the warmer months, though who leaves them and why is often unknown. The names carved into that stone are fragments rescued from archives, identified through careful genealogical work by researchers and family members who refuse to let them be forgotten entirely. There is also a plaque inside the bunker itself, placed there decades after the war by survivors and their descendants, commemorating the labor force. It is a modest thing, easy to overlook among the vast chamber and the heavy walls. Yet those who stand before it, reading the names and the simple statement of what occurred there, often find themselves changed by the encounter. It is as if the plaque creates a moment of necessary reckoning, a space where the historical abstraction, forced labor, construction of military installations transforms suddenly into human particularity. The survivors themselves became witnesses of a special kind. Many lived long lives, carried their memories into old age, gave interviews to historians and documentary makers, wrote memoirs, or contributed to oral history projects. Some spoke of the ways the experience had marked them, not merely psychologically, though that was profound, but in the body itself. Cold still triggered old fears. Enclosed spaces could feel suffocating. Certain sounds, the grinding of machinery, the shouting of commands in German, could transport them instantly back to the fjord. Yet survivors also frequently spoke of something else, the small moments of dignity and solidarity that persisted even in the depths of degradation. A guard who might secretly pass extra bread to a dying man, a fellow prisoner who shared his thin blanket on a winter night, an engineer who deliberately worked slowly, sabotaging the project in small, undetectable ways. These acts were dangerous and offered no grand alteration of circumstance, yet they mattered profoundly to those who experienced them and to those who heard their stories. The work of remembering has been slow and incomplete. Many forced laborers were never identified. Many graves were never found. Many families never received definitive news of what had become of their loved ones. In this absence, there is a particular kind of pain, not the closure that even grief provides, but an endless uncertainty that never fully settles. It is only in recent decades that movements for reparations and apologies have begun to address this suffering formally, with German governments acknowledging responsibility and offering financial compensation to survivors and their families. Whether such gestures can heal a wound so deep remains, perhaps, a question each survivor and each descendant must answer for themselves. The Dora bunker, viewed from above, appears almost innocent now, a technical marvel, an engineering achievement, an artifact of history. Yet beneath its massive concrete roof, in the darkness that no amount of daylight can fully penetrate, there remains an imprint of human suffering. Not a ghost, not a haunting. These are metaphors that perhaps diminish rather than honor what actually occurred. Rather, it is the simple fact that this structure was built upon the labor and the grief of countless people whose names have largely been lost. That fact does not disappear even when you leave the site and return to sunlight. It travels with you, a quiet knowledge of how history is written not only in grand narratives, but in the forgotten bodies of those who had no choice but to obey. The light comes slowly to Trondheim now, as it always has, though the witnesses to that breaking dawn are different than they once were. The fjord, mile upon mile of dark water held between ancient stone, begins its transformation from black to grey, to the palest blue of early morning, and if one were standing on the high ground above the city, watching the mist lift from those depths, there would be little visible sign of the fortress that lies beneath. This is perhaps the strangest mercy of time, that a structure conceived in fury and built in suffering, a bunker designed to outlast empires, has slowly surrendered not to bombs or artillery, or the relentless work of human hands, but to silence itself. The Dora U-boat base, that great concrete cathedral of German ambition, still exists. Its ceilings, those meters-thick shields of reinforced concrete poured by men whose names were never recorded, remain intact. The corridors where officers walked with purpose still stretch into darkness. The chambers where submarines were maintained and fueled and sent out to hunt still hold the ghosts of diesel fumes and urgent commands. And yet, standing in those spaces now, one encounters not the weight of history, but rather its opposite, an almost profound lightness, as though the building itself has exhaled after holding its breath for 80 years. What happened to memory here, in this place, is quieter than what happened during the war itself. The forced laborers who constructed these bunkers, prisoners of war, and conscripted workers, and those deemed enemies by a regime that saw enemies everywhere. They are remembered now in memorials of stone and in carefully maintained archives and in the testimonies of survivors who lived long enough to tell what they had witnessed. Their suffering did not end with the concrete being poured. Many of them did not leave this place alive. Many more carried wounds, both visible and invisible, for the remainder of their days. The fjord keeps their memory in its waters, and the silence of the bunker keeps it in its walls, and somewhere in that quiet preservation there is a form of dignity that was denied to them in life. The Norwegian landscape, the sweeping birch forests and the granite cliffs that rise from the water, has begun, very slowly, to reclaim what was taken. Nature does not move quickly in the north, but it moves with intention. Lichens grow on the concrete. Water finds its way into small cracks, and, in the freeze and thaw of countless winters, widens them imperceptibly. The metal fixtures rust. The paint that once covered the walls fades. Generations of Arctic foxes and white hares know nothing of the structure beneath the earth, except that it exists as a fold in the landscape, a place where the temperature remains constant, a refuge from wind. The birds that wheel above Trondheim in the early morning light know it not at all. There is something deeply human in the way we bury our history, and then, quietly, over the span of decades and centuries, permit nature to absorb it. The mightiest fortress eventually becomes less a monument to human will and more a feature of the earth itself. The Atlantic U-boat pens, that network of bunkers stretching from the Arctic to the Bay of Biscay, each one designed to be impregnable, each one constructed with resources that might have fed populations or healed wounds. They stand now as strange memorials to ambition itself, to the intensity with which human beings can pursue dominion, and to the remarkable indifference with which the world moves on. How many of the people who built Dora ever imagined that it would outlast every cause it was built to serve, that the very indestructibility they were forced to create would eventually become a kind of burden on the landscape, an uncomfortable reminder, a building that cannot be unmade and so must simply be lived with, watched over, occasionally toured by school children who are learning a history that feels, to them, distant and almost abstract. The paradox is profound. They built for permanence and achieved only irrelevance. They meant to create a weapon that would dominate the northern seas, and left, instead, a bunker that serves now as a museum of its own failure. In the early light, as the mist lifts and the fjord begins to show its true colors,